Hey there. Tonight we're stepping into the quiet, brutal world of medieval assassins, not the legendary figures with flowing cloaks and secret codes, but the forgotten men who moved in shadows, killed for coin, and vanished without a name. This isn't the tale of a noble avenger. It's the story of what happens when life corners you and the only way out is a blade. These were people history erased, silent, hunted, alone. But beneath the violence, there's something hauntingly human here. The desperation, the silence, the slow unraveling of a soul no one ever meant to remember. If you enjoy slipping into these darker corners of the past, feel free to like and subscribe, but only if it truly resonates. And I'd love to know where you're tuning in from and what time it is where you are. There's something comforting about knowing we're all drifting through time together in our own quiet way. Now dim the lights, settle in, and let's begin. Tonight we talk about the forgotten shadows of medieval history, the assassins. Not the sleek killers of legend, but the desperate souls who took the dirtiest jobs history had to offer. These were not heroes cloaked in mystery, leaping silently across rooftops with enchanted daggers and codes of honor. They were broken people, often discarded by society, crawling through the filth of alleyways and castle sewers to do one thing: kill. You won't find them in ballads. Their stories weren't sung by minstrels or painted on chapel ceilings. They existed in the cracks of history, spoken of only in fearful whispers and vague rumors. If their names were ever known, it was because they'd failed, or because their corpses were being displayed as a warning. This wasn't some secret guild of noble warriors avenging injustice. It was a job, a vile, short-lived job that required a steady hand, an empty conscience, and a willingness to never be remembered. The myth of the assassin is a comfortable lie we tell ourselves when we look back on the past. We like to imagine precision, elegance, strategy, a human chess piece moving silently through a decadent world of corruption and war. But in truth, being an assassin was anything but elegant. It was filthy, terrifying, and endlessly humiliating. No one trained you, no one fed you, no one gave you the secrets of the blade or the wisdom of poison. You got stabbed on your first job, or starved waiting for a client that never showed up. You were forced to navigate a world built against your very existence, not just the gates and guards of a noble's estate, but the ever-present danger of suspicion, betrayal, and superstition. You could be killed for being in the wrong place with the wrong look. You didn't walk through cities. You crept, watching every shadow, every face, every whisper, because once you were marked as an assassin, you stopped being a person. You became prey. Most of them didn't start out as killers. They were deserters, ex-thieves, failed mercenaries. Some were simply poor and invisible, the perfect trait for someone who needed to kill and vanish. A lucky few might have learned to fight in a war. Most didn't. They learned to survive by crawling through gutters, bribing drunks, and figuring out which rooms had creaky floorboards without ever being seen. It was a lifestyle of raw necessity, of ducking beneath morality and diving headfirst into anonymity. Because if anyone ever knew who you were, really knew, it meant your time was up. You couldn't leave a trail, a name, a face. You didn't even exist unless someone needed you. And the moment they no longer did, your best hope was to become dirt beneath their boots, forgotten and untraceable. Tonight's story isn't about glory, it's about desperation. It's about what happens when a man or woman is pushed so far to the edge of survival that they become the thing everyone fears. Not because they were born to it, but because they had no other choice. So turn down the lights and listen closely, because in the silence you might still hear their footsteps. And trust me, they were never soft. You didn't grow up dreaming of slitting throats for silver. You landed here because life shattered every better option first. No one sets out hoping to be a ghost in the night, paid to make people vanish. This life found you after the others had failed, or been taken from you. Maybe you were a farmer once, until the crops rotted and the landlord raised your rent. Maybe a soldier, abandoned by your lord after the war, with nothing but a half-rusted blade and memories of screams, or a thief caught one too many times, with hands too quick for honest work but not quick enough to stay out of chains. However it happened, by the time the idea of assassination crossed your mind, it wasn't a choice. It was a last resort. A grim path walked only by those with nothing left to lose, and no one left to miss them. The world didn't open its arms to people like you. The medieval era was cruel to the invisible. If you had no land, no name, no trade, you were nothing more than walking clutter to be pushed aside or punished. The cities were no kinder than the forests. 100 beggars lined the streets, all of them starving, all of them replaceable. You couldn't survive off pity, and crime came with the promise of gallows or the stocks. But kill someone? Quietly? For coin? Suddenly, your worth was measured in whispers and fear. People who wouldn't have given you a crust of bread now passed you purses of silver and never asked your name. For the first time in your life, you mattered, not as a man, but as a means to an end. And it changed you. This wasn't a profession. It was a condition. You didn't have apprenticeships or references. You had rumors and scars and a growing silence in your soul. Your friends disappeared. Your family, if they ever knew what you did, cut you off in fear or disgust. You slept in cellars, behind taverns, in crumbling barns with rats for company. You learned to live with a kind of permanent suspicion where even laughter felt dangerous because someone might remember the sound of your voice. You stopped looking people in the eye. You stopped trusting the kindness of strangers. You stopped being a person, not because you wanted to, but because that's what survival demanded. This life didn't just take your future, it rewrote your past. Whatever you had been before, a husband, a brother, a blacksmith's apprentice, that version of you was gone, lost beneath layers of false names and blood-stained memories. You didn't grow up dreaming of this. No one ever did. But here you were, clutching a dagger in the dark, whispering to yourself that the job would be over soon, that maybe this time you'd make enough to disappear for good. But you knew better. This life didn't let go. It only pulled you deeper until even your dreams started to forget your real name. You worked for liars, schemers, and petty nobles. And once the job was done, they wanted you silenced too. There was no loyalty in this line of work, no handshakes or lasting partnerships. You didn't build trust. You borrowed it, just long enough to slide a blade between someone's ribs and hope no one ever spoke of it again. Your clients weren't noble revolutionaries or tragic heroes trying to fix a broken world. They were bitter barons, jealous merchants, or trembling aristocrats who wanted their rivals gone without getting their own hands dirty. You weren't a savior. You were a tool, one they planned to bury once the job was finished. Because the one thing more dangerous than an enemy was a man who knew you paid to have someone murdered. They came to you in hoods and secrecy, speaking through intermediaries and passing notes instead of names. Half the time you didn't even know who your real employer was, just a messenger with a pouch of coins and a name to whisper in your ear. Make it look like an accident, they'd say. Don't let it lead back to me. As if you had options, as if anyone would believe you acted on your own. And when it was done, when the blood dried and the panic set in, those same clients would disappear, or worse, set dogs on your trail to clean up the mess they'd paid to create. Because hiring an assassin was only step one. Step two, making sure no one ever found out. Every job came with two dangers, the kill and the aftermath. The kill was straightforward, risky, brutal, ugly, but at least it was honest. The aftermath, though, was where things went wrong. Maybe the client had second thoughts. Maybe they worried you'd talk. Maybe they just decided not to pay. You'd show up for the rest of your silver, only to find a locked door or a tipped-off guard waiting in your place. Some clients even hired two assassins, one for the job, one to make sure there were no loose ends. And if you caught wind of that too late, congratulations. You just become the final act in your own contract. The worst part was knowing they never saw you as a person. To them, you were a rumor, a shadow, a necessary evil to be disposed of when the candle burned out. You could have risked your life crawling through a moat, strangling a bishop, poisoning a captain's wine, and still walk away with nothing but a cut on your arm and a target on your back. No gratitude, no loyalty, no protection. Just silence, expectation, and the unspoken rule. If they can find you after the job, they will. That was the deal you never agreed to, the price of doing business in the dark. And every time you took a coin, you knew deep down you might not live to spend it. You'd be promised a pouch of silver. Sometimes you got it. Most times you got double-crossed, or worse. That was the game. You didn't sign contracts. There were no written agreements, no seals of good faith. Your only guarantee was a whispered promise and a dirty coin purse, half now, half later, if you lived long enough to collect. It sounded simple, but in this world, payment was a slippery thing. Your client didn't want a relationship. They wanted a disappearance, and you were just the tool to make that happen. Once the target was dead, the assassin became the liability, the only witness to the crime. And nothing ties off a secret more neatly than another body dumped in a well. You'd learn, eventually, not to expect the second half of the coin. At first, you might show up to the meeting spot, blade still stained, eyes hollow from the night's work, expecting a nod of approval and a handful of silver. Instead, you'd find a shuttered window or an unfamiliar voice saying the noble had left town, or worse, a couple of men already drawing blades before you even opened your mouth. That was their idea of a bonus. Kill the killer, keep the silver, and sleep a little easier. You might survive that ambush, but you'd do it with scars, and the bitter knowledge that trust in this trade was just another way to die early. Some clients were clever about it. They'd pay in clipped coins, silver shaved to nothing, or foreign currency you couldn't use without raising questions. Others paid you with information, swearing it was worth more than gold. A name, a secret, a promise of protection from someone higher up the ladder. Lies, every single time. They didn't care about your future, only their own safety. And the fewer people who knew what they'd done, the better. You were never part of the plan beyond the night of the kill. After that, your death was just another layer of security. It got to the point where the smarter assassins started demanding full payment up front. No job without the silver in hand, but that came with its own risks. Some clients would agree, wait until you were asleep, then slit your throat and take it back. Others would vanish the moment they paid you, and you'd find out too late that the target didn't even exist. A decoy job to test your trust or burn a rival. And then there were the clients who simply thought you wouldn't dare come back if they didn't pay. Sometimes they were right. Other times the assassin made a second visit, not for gold, but revenge. In the end, payment was a gamble. You didn't take jobs expecting fortune. You took them hoping to survive long enough to buy food and maybe disappear for a while. The silver didn't make you rich. It kept you moving, hiding, living just one more week. And in this line of work, that was the best deal you were ever going to get. Forget secret temples and master mentors. Your training was a series of painful, near-fatal mistakes you barely survived. There was no old man in robes to teach you the way of the blade, no quiet courtyard where you learned to balance on rooftops with a sword in each hand. That was fantasy, not reality. The truth was far messier. You learned to kill by screwing it up, slowly, painfully, and often while bleeding. Your first attempt might have ended with a blade dropped at the worst moment, a window that slammed shut too soon, or a target that turned out to be far better at fighting than expected. If you lived through it, you got smarter. If you didn't, well, someone else would loot your boots and call it a day. Everything you knew came from watching, listening, guessing. You paid attention to how guards walked, how doors creaked, how servants whispered. You memorized the way shadows moved across stone and which dogs barked at strangers. Your teachers weren't sages, they were near misses. That time you almost fell from a roof but caught the edge with 2 fingers. The night you mistook the butler for the Baron and had to escape through a laundry chute with blood on your tunic and your heart trying to claw its way out of your chest. These weren't lessons, they were warnings from a world that didn't care if you got it right the first time, or ever. If you had military experience, that helped, a little. You might have known how to hold a blade or throw a punch, but the battlefield and the alley were different worlds. War was loud, chaotic, and messy. Assassination was silent, focused, and terrifyingly personal. You couldn't just swing and hope. You had to be precise. One chance, one cut, one breath between life and being dragged out by your ankles. And if you had no experience at all, you learned fast. Or you didn't learn anything because you were already buried. Poison, trial and error, mostly error. You didn't have chemistry. You had rumors and dead ends. Crush this root, mix with that herb. Pray it didn't just make the target vomit and go on alert. Or worse, kill the wrong person. Or even worse than that, kill you. You carried your doses in leather satchels or hollowed out teeth and hoped the labels didn't smear in the rain. There was no poison master to teach you the right mix, just word of mouth and the memory of which concoction left a nobleman twitching on the floor versus which one merely gave him a suspicious rash. You didn't graduate from this school. There was no ceremony. Your education came in the form of bruises, scars, and the growing numbness in your chest. And every time you walked away from a job, you carried a little more knowledge and a little more damage. The only diploma you ever got was survival, and even that had to be earned over and over again. The first time never leaves you. It's messy, loud, and never like the stories. And after, you're someone else, someone colder. People like to imagine that the first kill is cinematic, something clean and poetic. A silent breath, a single strike, a life taken in the dark while the world holds its breath. But reality doesn't care about your imagination. The first time you try to kill someone, really kill them, it's a storm. Your hands shake. Your breath comes in gasps. You miss your mark, or your knife sticks, or your target fights back with a scream that pierces your skull like a bell that never stops ringing. The blade doesn't glide, it tears. The blood doesn't stay quiet, it surges, warm and real and full of a life that doesn't want to end. And when it's over, you don't walk away proud. You walk away soaked, panicked, and permanently changed. You don't forget the smell. That's what no one tells you. Blood, sweat, the acrid stench of fear, your own and theirs. It clings to your clothes, seeps into your skin, follows you like a phantom. You try to wash it off, but it lingers, just beneath the surface, like a scar you can't quite see. You can't sleep afterward. You lie awake in the dark, replaying every second, wondering if the noise you heard was someone coming to arrest you or the echo of a dying man's final breath. You flinch at footsteps. You imagine the faces of people you pass in the street. Did they see you? Do they know? The paranoia isn't just real, it's your new shadow. And yet, somehow, you live. You run. You vanish. You keep breathing. But something inside you isn't quite the same. A wall goes up. Not overnight, not all at once, but slowly. With each passing day, you speak a little less, you laugh a little less, you feel a little less. That first kill doesn't just take a life, it takes part of you too. The part that once hesitated, that once cared. It rips it out and replaces it with silence. Not peace, never peace, but silence like a stone dropped into the deepest part of you, sinking, pulling. And what's worse, you remember their face, always. Not just how they died, but the expression when they realized what was happening. The fear, the pleading, the shock. That final second where they understood they were never going to see another sunrise. That face stays with you, whether you want it to or not. It's there when you close your eyes. It's there in the eyes of every future target. You tell yourself it gets easier. And in some ways it does. But the first one? That's the one that cracks your soul open and pours something cold and poisonous inside. From then on, you don't just kill to survive. You survive because now you're someone who kills. Your gear was stolen, makeshift, or barely functional. A chipped dagger and a frayed rope were luxury. The idea that assassins carried sleek weapons crafted in secret forges or enchanted with ancient power is a lie told by poets and fools. In truth, you used what you could find, what you could steal, or what no one would miss. Your knife was likely taken from a drunk guard or pulled from a battlefield corpse, dull at the edge and notched at the tip. Your rope had been used before, for hauling grain, tying oxen, or hanging criminals, and every time you climbed with it, you prayed the threads wouldn't split mid-drop. There was no pride in your tools, only need, only function, only the bare hope they wouldn't fail you at the worst possible moment. Poison, if you had it, came from weeds you crushed yourself, or from whispered recipes traded behind taverns and scribbled in the margins of stolen almanacs. No vials with neat labels, no perfect droppers or syringes, just a scrap of linen soaked in something bitter and deadly. Or not, because half the time, poison didn't kill. It made people retch, sweat, scream, or stiffen just long enough to alert the entire household. And God's help you if you mixed it wrong. One misstep, and the killer became the corpse. You learned through guesswork and luck. Sometimes the venom just turned the wine a strange color. Other times, it dropped a man where he stood. And you never quite knew which outcome you'd get until it was too late. You might have had a garrote if you were fortunate, 2 bits of wire and a pair of bones to grip, tucked into your belt behind your back. Silent, brutal, effective. But if you didn't, you improvised. A leather strap, a scarf, even a belt torn from a discarded tunic. You weren't outfitted like a soldier. You were outfitted like a scavenger, 1 foot from starvation, praying that whatever you carried wouldn't betray you the moment your hands began to shake. And if it did, you adapted. You once finished a job with a slate roof tile, another time with a broken table leg. You didn't train with weapons. You learned to turn anything sharp or heavy into a tool of silence. There were no backups, no reinforcements. If your blade bent, if your rope frayed, if the vial shattered in your pocket, you were on your own. You had no smith to complain to, no quartermaster to beg for supplies. You stitched your own gloves, sharpened your own edge on rough stone, and hoped the cold didn't make your hands useless when it mattered most. In your line of work, the gear didn't make the assassin. Desperation did. Resourcefulness did. You didn't need perfect tools. You needed tools that would work once, in the dark, before you ran like hell into the night. And that was all you ever had, 1 shot, 1 breath, and whatever was in your pocket when the job began. There were no teams, no reinforcements. You worked alone, and if something went wrong, and it usually did, you were done for. You didn't have a handler waiting in the shadows, no lookout on the rooftop, no ally with a horse ready at the edge of the woods. There were no whispered signals or coordinated escapes. It was just you, a stolen blade, and the growing certainty that the plan you made was already falling apart. This wasn't a storybook heist with moving pieces and backup strategies. It was improvisation under pressure. And in this world, hesitation meant death. There were no second chances, no redos, only the awful silence after something snapped, and you realized there was no one coming to help. Sometimes you tried to plan. You mapped escape routes in your head, studied the guard rotations, counted paces between doors. But then a torch fell, or a dog barked, or a noble decided to have a midnight stroll, and everything unraveled in seconds. The rope you counted on was missing. The alleyway you marked as safe was suddenly filled with servants. The window was barred from the inside. And in that moment, your heart tried to claw its way out of your chest, because the only thing more terrifying than a job gone wrong was knowing you had to fix it alone, with nothing but instinct and a half-broken weapon. You couldn't call for help. You couldn't shout or signal. No one was waiting for you with a change of clothes or a forged document. You ran if you were lucky. You hid if there was time. Sometimes you had to kill someone who wasn't part of the plan. A maid who saw too much. A stable boy who noticed your face. And then you had to live with that too. Because even when the mission went right, it went wrong. No matter how careful you were, the world didn't cooperate. Rain turned stone slick. Doors warped and jammed. Guards stayed longer than expected. The world was always against you, and you had only one ally, your own stubborn will to not die tonight. You didn't get to debrief. You didn't get to sit down and talk about what went wrong, or how to improve for next time. Your only reward for surviving a job gone wrong was the bitter knowledge that next time could be worse. You patched your own wounds. You burned your own clothes. You lay awake at night wondering how close you came to being caught or killed, and what might happen when someone recognized you a week from now in a crowded street. You didn't learn teamwork. You learned solitude, paranoia, how to sleep in 10-minute bursts, and how to disappear without leaving a trail. Because in the end, you weren't part of a brotherhood. You weren't part of anything. You were a ghost, and ghosts had no backup. Just silence, shadows, and the constant sound of your own heart pounding like a war drum in the dark. Blending in meant stinking like a peasant and hoping no one asked why your cloak rattled with hidden knives. Disguises in medieval times weren't clever, clean, or especially convincing. There were no wardrobes filled with custom-fitted outfits or magical cloaks that turned you into mist. There were hand-me-down tunics, half-rotten boots, and stolen robes that smelled like their previous owners, because they were probably still decomposing somewhere in a ditch. If you wanted to blend in, you had to look like everyone else. Dirty, exhausted, half-starved, and forgettable. You couldn't be the most attractive person in the room. You had to be the one no one looked at twice. The shadow in the corner. The smudge in the background. The man with nothing to say and even less to offer. But it was harder than it sounded. Peasants could spot a stranger by the way they held a spoon. Servants knew the names of every kitchen boy and chambermaid. Guards watched your hands, your posture, your gait. One slip, one wrong word, one unfamiliar face, and someone would start asking questions. Who are you? Who sent you? Why don't you smell like turnips? You couldn't memorize every backstory. You couldn't plan for every suspicion. So you kept your head down, your mouth shut, and your answers vague. And if that didn't work, you ran, or killed, and then ran anyway. Even the clothes betrayed you. A robe that was too clean marked you as suspicious. A cloak that hung wrong made people stare. You tried to layer up, to mask the shape of the tools beneath, but it was never perfect. Knives made noise. Vials clinked. Ropes bulked out your silhouette. Every step felt like a gamble, every glance a risk. You prayed for darkness, for distraction, for no one to notice that the stable boy now had scars and didn't know the name of the cook's dog. You pretended to limp. You faked coughs. You wrapped bandages around your head and claimed a fever when someone looked too closely. Lies were your only armor, and it was thin, and it tore easily. Masks? They weren't a thing. If you covered your face, you looked like a leper or a criminal. Or worse, someone trying not to be seen. You couldn't just pull a hood over your head and melt into the crowd. Half the time you looked more suspicious than the person you were trying to kill. And if anyone called you out, a merchant, a servant, a bored knight, the entire job could unravel. You didn't just need to disappear. You had to look like you belonged before you did. Your disguise gave you maybe 5 minutes of safety, 10 if you were lucky. It wasn't a shield, it was a delay. A pause before someone noticed your boots didn't match, or your accent was wrong, or your hands were too clean for a pig farmer. And when they did, that was it. You weren't the hunter anymore. You were the target. A man in borrowed clothes with too many secrets, standing in the wrong place at the worst possible time. Poisons were unpredictable, and the real risk was accidentally killing yourself before the target even tasted the stew. The stories make it sound like a graceful art. A pinch of something exotic in a goblet, a nobleman gasping mid-toast, then silence. But real poison in the medieval world was nothing like that. It was a messy gamble with poor ingredients and worse instructions. You didn't have access to neat vials labeled deadly or fast-acting. You had roots, powders, mushrooms with names no one could agree on, and folk remedies passed around by half-mad herbalists. Half the time, what you were given was a sleeping agent. The other half, it was just a bitter spice. And on the rare occasions, it was actually lethal. It was just as dangerous to the person carrying it as it was to the one who was supposed to drink it. There was no poison master teaching the secrets of the craft. You learned by trial, by theft, and by watching others suffer. You'd smear a mixture on a rat's crumb of bread and wait, staring at the thing for hours, trying to guess whether its sudden twitch was a sign of death or indigestion. You'd carry that same mixture into the castle kitchen, tucked in a scrap of cloth or hidden inside a hollowed reed, praying you didn't mix up which pocket held the fatal powder and which held salt. The paranoia never left. Every time you handled a dose, your hands trembled, not from fear of the kill, but from the very real chance that a stray wind might send a trace into your own eyes or mouth. Delivering the poison was even worse. You weren't a guest at the feast. You were a stranger in the shadows, slipping something into food that passed through half a dozen hands before reaching your mark. And medieval kitchens were chaos. Loud, hot, crowded, full of shouting cooks and sharp-eyed servants. There were tasters, sometimes dogs, sometimes slaves, sometimes even priests blessing the food. Getting your poison into the meal was like threading a needle during a stampede. And even if it worked, there was no guarantee it would be fast. Many poisons took hours, even days to show symptoms. You might watch your target eat the entire portion and walk away humming a hymn. Or worse, vomit and survive, now alert and very angry. And guess who was suddenly being searched for by every guard in the keep? If it failed publicly. If it worked, the cause wasn't always clear. People in the Middle Ages died for all kinds of reasons. Bad meat, bad water, bad luck. But a death with no wound and no witnesses? That drew suspicion. You might escape that night, but someone would start digging. And if your name came up, or your face was remembered, or the kitchen boy described the man with the odd accent and the herbal pouch, you were a dead man walking. Poison wasn't precise. It was terrifying. It was uncertain, and it was just as likely to ruin your life as end someone else's. But for many assassins, it was the only option left when a blade wasn't possible. A silent gamble in a noisy world, and the odds were never in your favor. The hardest part wasn't the kill. It was sneaking into places no one should be, unseen, unheard, unnoticed. Getting close was the real work, the real danger. You didn't walk up to your target in a dark alley and stab them like some drunken thug. You had to get inside. Past walls, past guards, past servants who knew every face in the household. You had to become invisible in a world that had no patience for strangers. And no matter how good you were at climbing walls or mimicking accents, one wrong glance, one wrong footstep, and the whole thing came crashing down around you. Killing a man took seconds. Reaching him without being caught, that could take days of planning. And even then, it rarely went as planned. Every noble house was a puzzle box. Stone corridors, blind corners, guards with changing shifts. Servants who noticed when an unfamiliar face fumbled with a chamber pot or walked the wrong way to the kitchens. And forget the fantasy of hidden passages and conveniently unlocked doors. You had to study. You spent nights watching from rooftops, memorizing patrol routes, learning which windows were left open in summer and which hallways stayed empty after sunset. Sometimes you'd pose as a tradesman or sneak in during festivals when the staff was drunk and the halls were full of music. But even then, one misstep could end it all. A guard with a good memory, a barking dog, a candle that flickered just enough to show your shadow. And the closer you got, the harder it became. You couldn't breathe loudly. You couldn't rush. There was a moment in every job, just before the act, where the world seemed to tighten around you. Every sound became thunder. Every heartbeat felt like a drum. You'd crouch in a stairwell or freeze behind a tapestry, the blade slick in your grip, waiting for the footsteps to pass, praying no one noticed the sweat dripping from your brow or the slight tremble in your hand. You weren't afraid of dying. You were afraid of being noticed, of being caught before you even had the chance to complete the job. Because failure in this profession wasn't a fine or a scolding. It was a slow, brutal death at the hands of angry guards, or worse, the people who paid you in the first place. You learned tricks. Stuff hay under your boots to muffle your steps. Pack clay in your mouth to stop your teeth from chattering. Grease your cloak to prevent fabric from rustling. But even with every precaution, the risk never dropped below a coin toss. Getting close meant placing your life in a stranger's house, trusting in luck, instinct, and the hope that tonight wouldn't be the night someone decided to check the shadows twice. The act itself was brief, a thrust, a twist, a muffled gasp, but the journey to that moment was a gauntlet, and every successful kill was less a mark of skill, more a testament that you hadn't yet run out of luck. Barons, bishops, generals, paranoid, guarded, and very hard to get close to without becoming part of the feast's entertainment. These weren't careless men lounging in open courtyards waiting for fate to catch up with them. These were powerful people who knew exactly how many enemies they had and spent every waking moment making sure they stayed alive. Getting to them wasn't a matter of sneaking past a dozing guard or bribing a sleepy cook. It was months of planning for 5 seconds of terror, because these targets didn't sleep in beds, they slept in fortresses. Fortresses with layers of steel, flesh, and suspicion between you and their beating heart. And even if you made it that far, they were likely armed, alert, and ready to gut you with a decorative dagger they kept under the pillow. Every inch of space between you and your mark was hostile ground. You didn't walk through empty hallways. You crept past armed guards trained to kill, servants loyal enough to recognize a stranger by the way they carried a tray, and dogs bred for nothing but tearing throats. Even the walls worked against you, echoing footsteps, creaking floorboards, doors that groaned when you breathed on them. Nobles didn't live in homes, they lived in traps, and every one of them was designed to keep people like you out. And if they were truly important, a crown-backed noble, a bishop with the king's ear, the paranoia turned theatrical. Fake rooms, decoy beds, testers for their wine, food, and even their bathwater. They knew someone wanted them dead. And the only thing more dangerous than a powerful man is a powerful man who expects a knife in the dark. Getting close meant becoming someone else. A stable hand, a scribe, a mute kitchen boy. You studied your role like a priest studied scripture, rehearsing the part until it was second nature. But even then, all it took was one forgotten name, one slip in your story, and suddenly you were surrounded and bleeding. Because they didn't just watch the doors, they watched each other. In noble courts, everyone spied on everyone. A single odd look was enough to trigger suspicion, and suspicion meant questions, and questions meant pain. The more secure your target, the more likely they were to strike first and ask later. There were tales of would-be assassins who got as far as the dining hall before being spotted by the jester who'd seen too many strangers and called for the guards mid-performance. And if somehow you reached them, in their chambers behind the curtains, in the narrow moments between sleep and suspicion, you still weren't safe. These weren't helpless nobles waiting to die. Many of them were former soldiers or men who'd climbed to power through sheer brutality. They kept weapons close, and they didn't hesitate. There were stories of barons waking mid-stab and grappling with the assassin before bleeding out. Stories of bishops who wore chainmail beneath their nightshirts, of generals who slept with dogs chained to the bedposts. These weren't just targets, they were battles in human form, and winning meant surviving a war that lasted less than a minute and often left you crawling out a window, covered in blood, with nothing but silence to show for it. Getting past guards was bad, but a barking dog or a curious servant could end you just as fast. Everyone assumes it's the armored men with halberds that make the job hard. And yes, they're a problem. Big, loud, heavily armed, and usually bored enough to notice when something's off. But you could study guards. You could learn their routes, their shifts, their habits, when they stopped for a smoke or ducked into a corridor to piss. You could work around guards. What you couldn't plan for was the bloody dog. The mutt with nothing better to do than sniff at your trail and sound the alarm the moment you stepped too close to the wrong door. A knight's hound didn't need a reason to ruin your life. It just needed to exist. You'd be in position, hidden in the dark, silent as breath, and then a wet nose, a low growl, and your entire night unraveled in seconds. Dogs didn't follow a pattern. They didn't have a shift. They just wandered, tails wagging, sniffing under tables and behind curtains. And if you smelled like strange sweat and iron, they knew something was wrong. And once they barked, you were done. No one asked why the dog was barking. They just assumed something terrible was happening and came running with torches and swords. You couldn't kill the dog either, not without noise, not without blood, not without someone noticing a limp body and connecting the dots. And if you did manage to silence it, you'd still have a trail to hide and a corpse to explain. Because in noble houses, dogs were often treated better than servants. And if Lord Edwin's favorite hound turned up dead, you better believe someone was going to start asking who had reason and access. Then there were the servants. Gods, the servants. Sharp-eyed, quiet-tongued, and smarter than any noble ever gave them credit for. They noticed things: a new face in the wrong uniform, boots that didn't quite match the floor mud, a man claiming to be the new scullion but not knowing where the root cellar was. They noticed, and they whispered. Not because they were cruel, but because in a noble household, gossip was survival. Calling out an assassin in disguise might mean a promotion, or at the very least, not getting blamed when the bishop turns up with a throat full of regret. You didn't just have to fool the lords, you had to fool the staff. And that was often harder. They remembered faces, they remembered names, and they remembered when someone asked too many questions about where the wine was stored or how to reach the second floor without passing through the guard room. You couldn't kill them, not without unraveling the entire job. So you had to pretend, to be dumb, to be invisible, to laugh when they joked and nod when they talked. You became part of the background. But even then, the risk never left. One raised eyebrow, one passing remark to the head steward, and you were being dragged by the ankles through the gravel courtyard while the Baron's dogs howled at your heels. It wasn't always the sword that ended the job. Sometimes it was the bark, or the glance, or the stable boy who remembered that the real Thomas had red hair, not brown. The closer you got to your target, the more ways the room could betray you: creaky floorboards, loose tiles, and hidden watchers. People think the danger ends once you're inside, that you've beaten the guards, fooled the servants, dodged the dogs, and now it's just a matter of slipping the blade between someone's ribs while they snore. But the truth is, the room itself becomes your worst enemy. It's not just what's in it, it's what you don't know. A bedroom might look empty, but it's alive with traps waiting to expose you. The floor groans in strange places. The window latch snaps too loud. The door's hinges scream like a banshee. And when you're one breath away from a kill, every sound is thunder. Rooms in noble estates weren't built for comfort. They were built for power, for spectacle, and, especially among the paranoid elite, for defense. Some had hidden guard holes carved into the walls, slits just wide enough for a pair of eyes to watch without being seen. You thought you were alone, but someone could be watching you from behind the fireplace grate or listening from a priest hole in the floor. And nobles didn't trust sleep. They locked themselves in with bolted doors, bells strung to hinges, or tripwires stretched across the floor like a spider's web. Even the arrangement of furniture could betray you. A chair positioned just so, designed to block your approach or force a stumble at the worst possible second. You had to move like smoke. But even then, the room conspired to ruin you. Maybe your foot landed on a loose tile, loud as a shout. Maybe your cloak brushed against a tapestry and stirred the air just enough to make a candle flicker. And that flicker woke your mark. Maybe you didn't notice the cup of wine by the bedside, still full, meaning they weren't asleep after all. Maybe they were pretending, waiting, dagger under the pillow. And suddenly, you weren't the hunter anymore. You were locked in a silent room with someone just as dangerous, with no way out but through. And then there were the things you couldn't control. The target coughed, rolled over, muttered in their sleep. And now your clean line is gone. A servant knocks. A breeze blows the shutters open. A mouse darts across the floor and startles you into bumping a table. Every second was a new risk, and your mind had to calculate every sound, every shadow, every flicker of torchlight. You could spend hours getting into that room and ruin it all in a heartbeat. Because the moment you stepped through that doorway, you weren't just in the final phase of the job. You were in the most dangerous place in the entire fortress, the one where silence had to be perfect, timing had to be divine, and death could come not from failure, but from the smallest sound in a room that heard everything. Killing was the easy part. Getting out alive was the real miracle. The moment your blade struck true, the moment your target gasped or gurgled or simply went limp, the clock started ticking. You weren't finished. You were in more danger than ever, because now the entire household was your enemy. Every hallway, every stairwell, every creaking board beneath your boots was a trap waiting to spring. The blood might still be warm, the body not yet discovered, and already your window for escape was shrinking. No backup, no cover story, no safe passage. Just you, the scent of death on your hands, and a dozen different chances to die before you made it back to the street. Everything that had worked in your favor on the way in, it worked against you now. Guards changed shifts. Doors that had been left ajar were suddenly shut. The corridor that was empty 10 minutes ago now held two servants gossiping near a torch. And worst of all, your hands were shaking. The adrenaline didn't help you now. It betrayed you, made you clumsy, made you fast when you needed to be quiet, or too slow when you needed to run. Every second spent inside after the kill was a second the house had to react. And the house always reacted. Nobles didn't sleep like peasants. Their deaths rang like alarms. And someone always noticed the silence or the blood. If you were lucky, you had a route. A drain pipe, a stable door, a loose grate in the garden wall. If you were truly fortunate, the escape took you back through a servant's hall during a change of shift, a blur of movement where no one had time to ask questions. But most nights weren't like that. Most nights you ran, or crawled, or leapt from a second-story window into a pile of compost, bones rattling in your chest as dogs howled behind you. You tore cloaks on splinters, left bits of yourself in hedges and gutters. You hoped the blood on your sleeve was your target's, not your own. But you never stopped moving. Because if they found the body before you vanished, they sealed the exits, locked the gates, sent every stable boy and guard into the streets to hunt for a pale face and trembling hands. And your client? Gone. Or worse, watching. Maybe they were already slipping away with their alibi rehearsed. Or maybe they'd tipped someone off, hoping you wouldn't make it out at all. You had no one to meet, no one to vouch for you. If someone caught you in the act, they'd scream. If they caught you after, they'd kill you. The law wouldn't save you. It didn't care why the noble died or who paid for it, or whether you begged for mercy. The gallows didn't ask questions. And neither did the crowd that gathered to watch your neck snap. So you ran. Through the alleys, over the roofs, under the city itself, if you had to. You changed clothes in the dark, burned what you wore, tossed your blade in the river. You left the job behind, but the job never really left you. Every escape left you more broken than before. And when you finally slipped into the shadows beyond the walls, there was no celebration. Just cold, silence, and the ache in your bones that whispered, "Next time, you won't be so lucky." People feared assassins, yes, but they feared them like monsters. And monsters get hunted. You didn't earn admiration or loyalty. You didn't walk into a tavern and get nods of respect like a returning soldier. You got glances, sideways, nervous, calculating. No one wanted to sit too close. No one wanted to ask questions. Because everyone knew that if the rumors were true, you'd slit a throat for a coin and vanish before the body hit the ground. You weren't a man. You were a threat. And threats don't get friends. They get watched. They get whispered about. They get stabbed in the back before they can do the same to someone else. The fear you cultivated was a blade that cut both ways. The worst part? That fear followed you even when you weren't working. A strange man at a village inn? Must be trouble. A hooded figure asking directions near the Lord's manor? Better call the constable. You could be passing through, hungry and cold, and someone would still grab their children and cross the road. Because in the stories, assassins didn't retire. They didn't settle down. They haunted roads and castles, working for kings one day and rebels the next. People didn't think of you as human. They thought of you as something that crept in the dark with poison in your pocket and a list of names memorized by heart. Superstition made it worse. They said assassins could vanish in smoke, that they could steal your soul with a touch, that they whispered curses or wore charms made from the bones of children. Nonsense, of course, but belief didn't care about truth. And in a world where saints and demons were both considered real, a man who could kill without being seen was as good as cursed. Peasants saw you as a bad omen. Nobles saw you as a liability. Guards saw you as target practice. You couldn't explain yourself. You couldn't deny the rumors. Because the moment you opened your mouth, someone would hear the lie they were already looking for. And once your reputation spread, even jobs became dangerous. People hired you for the myth, expected miracles, impossibilities, murders that no sane man could pull off. And when you failed, when you reminded them you were flesh and blood and not a shadow with a blade, they turned on you. Fast. A failed myth is worse than a threat. It's a disappointment, and disappointment is punished. You'd be blamed for things you never did, killings you had no part in, entire conspiracies invented just to justify someone chasing you across counties with a blade and a warrant. You didn't live with a reputation, you ran from it. You tried to bury it with new names, new faces, new scars, but it always caught up. Someone always remembered. Someone always whispered. You could vanish for years and still find your old shadow waiting in the next town. Because once they decided you were a monster, it didn't matter who you used to be. It didn't matter if you'd never killed again. The only way the story ended was with a rope, a torch, or a knife in the back, delivered by someone who said he was dangerous, and everyone else nodded. Even a whisper that you were strange could get you stoned, drowned, or worse. Villages in the Middle Ages weren't places of quiet understanding or patient conversation. They were tight-lipped, God-fearing hives of suspicion. Everyone knew everyone, and if you weren't someone they knew, if you didn't have a family name, a trade, a clear reason for being where you were already one wrong glance from becoming a threat. And if someone muttered the word assassin, even without proof, even in jest, it was over. No one asked for evidence. No one waited for a trial. A village didn't need truth, it needed safety. And safety meant getting rid of anything that smelled like danger. The worst part was how fast it happened. One child says you walk too quiet. One drunk swears you don't blink enough. One old woman insists you appeared out of nowhere and started asking about the mayor's comings and goings. That's all it took. The priest stares at you too long during a sermon. The innkeeper refuses to look you in the eye. The baker who gave you a smile yesterday now won't hand you bread without flinching. Something shifts. You feel it in the way doors close as you pass, how conversations hush when you step too close. The air thickens with fear, and fear doesn't think. It acts. They wouldn't call the guards. Guards took too long, cost too much, and might ask questions the villagers didn't want to answer. Instead, they handled it themselves. A few men with farm tools, maybe a priest with a torch. And suddenly, you're on trial in the town square, surrounded by people who used to smile at you while handing you cheese. Now they want blood. You're not just a stranger, you're a curse, a shadow, a threat to their children, their animals, their crops. Something to be purged before God notices and strikes them all with plague. You couldn't argue. Reason made you look guiltier. Protest and you confirmed their fears. Try to run and they chased you like a fox. The lucky ones got tied to a cart and banished. The unlucky ones got tied to a stake. Because villages didn't believe in subtlety, they believed in fire, stone, and water. Trial by drowning? If you sank, you were innocent and dead. If you floated, you were a servant of evil and burned. And if you fought back, you proved everything they feared. You learned, fast, to avoid the small towns, to keep moving, to say as little as possible and pretend to be a tanner, a pilgrim, a mute. You hid your blades under sacks of barley and smeared your face with soot. You slept in fields and barns, never the same place twice, because once a village had its eye on you, you were already dead. Not because they knew who you were, but because they didn't. And in their world, different was just another word for dangerous. Assassins were seen as both godless killers and devilish sorcerers. Either way, you burned. The church didn't hand out nuance in medieval times. You were either part of the flock or something to be purged. And someone who killed in silence without banners or orders didn't fit neatly into their categories. You weren't a soldier. You weren't an executioner. You were a blade with no master and no prayer. That made you dangerous, not just to lords and barons, but to the soul of the community. Because to them, if you weren't blessed by the church, you must have been blessed by something darker, something infernal. And once that idea took root, there was no washing it away. They didn't need to see you with a spell book or a pentagram. They just needed to hear that you moved too quietly, that you were seen where you shouldn't be, that someone died not long after you passed through town. People already believed in curses, in demons that wore human skin, in witches who whispered at the moon. You didn't even have to say anything strange. Just saying nothing was enough. If you didn't cross yourself at the right time, if you didn't kneel during Mass, if you asked too many questions about noblemen's routines, you were marked. And the mark wasn't a scar or a tattoo. It was silence. It was isolation. And eventually, it was fire. The church didn't want justice. It wanted spectacle, a demonstration. One sinner torched in the name of righteousness to keep 100 peasants in line. And assassins made perfect examples. You were already on the fringe, already feared, already accused of things you probably didn't do, and a few you definitely did. But once the clergy got hold of you, it wasn't about your crimes. It was about your soul. They'd shave your head, bind your hands, strip you of your clothes, and force a confession. And if you didn't give them one, they'd take it anyway, with iron and flame. The worst part? No one came to your defense. Not the client who paid you. Not the thief you once spared. Not the noble you failed to kill. In their eyes, you weren't a person. You were a stain. A cautionary tale. They gathered in crowds to watch you burn, not because they hated you, but because they needed to believe that your death made their world safer, cleaner, more holy. They didn't cheer because they knew you. They cheered because you weren't them. You couldn't run from the cross. It was everywhere, on churches, in courtrooms, stitched into flags. You were caught between them, hemmed in by superstition and sanctimony. The kings wanted you dead because you killed in the dark. The priests wanted you dead because they couldn't see your soul. You didn't belong to heaven or hell, and that terrified them more than anything. Because if someone like you could live outside their rules, then maybe the rules meant nothing. And in a world built on fear, nothing was more dangerous than proof that fear could be beaten. So they made sure you couldn't. They didn't just kill assassins. They erased them in ash, in scripture, in fire so hot It made the sky weep. You had to keep every job secret, every contact buried, every name erased, even your own. In a profession built on whispers and shadows, silence wasn't just a rule, it was survival. Talking got you killed. Remembering got you hunted. Even thinking too hard about the people who hired you was a risk. Every job was a ghost. You took the payment, you did the work, and then you buried the memory with the body. There was no bragging. No stories told over ale. No ledger of victories. The best assassin left no trace, not in the streets, not in the mind, and definitely not on paper. If you were smart, you didn't even keep your real name. That person was dead the day you took your first contract. You lived in fragments. A different alias in every town, a different accent, a different scar. One week you were Tomas the weaver's son. The next, Brother Giles the penitent monk. You forgot birthdays, places, pasts. You couldn't afford consistency. It made you recognizable. You didn't return to old haunts. You didn't check in with old friends. Because if you did, the trail would catch up to you. A curious guard, a wronged noble, a client who decided to clean up loose ends. Anyone could turn on you, and anyone with the right incentive could put a knife in your back and a reward in their pocket. And the isolation, it wasn't romantic. It wasn't noble. It was suffocating. You couldn't confide in anyone. Couldn't tell someone what you'd done, what you'd seen, what you were running from. You carried it alone. Every kill, every lie, every betrayal. It sat in your chest like a stone, and you got used to the weight. But it never stopped pressing down. You stopped speaking your real thoughts. You stopped reacting to pain. You stopped dreaming of anything but escape. Silence made you a ghost, but it also hollowed you out. Even the people who hired you expected silence. They didn't want a conversation. They didn't want a face they could remember. They wanted a shape in the dark that disappeared once the job was done. And if you were foolish enough to speak their name, even in private, even once, it was over. You became a liability. And the only thing worse than an assassin who failed was an assassin who talked. That was a death sentence written in whispers and carried out in alleys. You lived by staying invisible, by being forgotten, and eventually, even you forgot yourself. That was the price. No gravestone, no legacy, no real name left to mourn. The only people who remembered you were the ones who wanted you gone. You became a rumor, a shadow, a warning told to squires and stable hands. Don't ask questions. Don't get clever. You don't want to end up like him. And the truth was, they were right. Because for every job you completed, a little more of you disappeared with it, until there was nothing left but silence, and the faint sound of a door closing behind you for the last time. Miss your shot, and they didn't just kill you. They made you scream first, for sport, for justice, or for someone's entertainment. There was no clean death for an assassin who failed. No swift blade, no quiet noose. If you were caught, and it only took one slip, one unexpected turn, one locked door where you needed an exit, you didn't get mercy. You got made an example. You were dragged through stone corridors by your hair, spat on by men who had never killed but held the power to make you wish you never had. You weren't seen as human. You were a problem to be solved with iron and fire. Justice in the Middle Ages wasn't blind. It was theatrical. And few things drew a crowd like the unraveling of a would-be killer. They tied you to posts in the square, let children throw rocks at your face before the real punishment began. Your sentence wasn't read. It was inflicted. Fingers were broken one by one to learn who sent you. Ribs cracked, teeth pulled, skin peeled back in strips. And if you didn't talk, they assumed you were hiding something and simply tried harder. A hot poker down the throat, thumbs crushed in vices, nails torn out and used to scratch names into your chest, just in case the pain jogged your memory. You learned very quickly that death was not the worst thing that could happen to you. The worst thing was surviving long enough to regret everything. They didn't care who you were, just who you worked for. And if you didn't tell them, or worse, if they believed you didn't know, the agony lasted longer. Torture was a tool, but it was also a pastime. Nobles and priests both found satisfaction in hearing you confess sins real or imagined. The more you screamed, the more certain they were of your guilt. Even if the job had nothing to do with them, even if you'd killed for a different client in a different city, you'd still bleed for their peace of mind. And if you did talk, if you gave them names, faces, places, it didn't matter. No one believed an assassin. They just used your words as a map to burn down whoever was next. Your client, their rival, a maid who'd once brought you bread. Your voice was poison. And when it was finished, they cut it off. Literally, if they were feeling symbolic. You were never meant to survive the cage. The screams, yes. Those echoed in the courtyard for days. But the body? That got dumped somewhere quiet, headless, if they were merciful. Still burning, if they weren't. Failure didn't end with you dying. It ended with you dying badly. Alone, broken, erased. And every assassin knew it. That's why the blade had to be true. The step had to be silent. The timing perfect. Because if it wasn't, if you hesitated, if you missed, you didn't just lose. You became the evening's entertainment, a lesson in what happens when the shadow stumbles and the light catches up. If someone survived your blade, your likeness spread fast. And then everyone was looking. In a world without cameras, the sketch was the noose. The moment your target lived long enough to shout your description, or worse, the moment a servant saw your face as you fled, it was over. Your features became public property. A rough drawing pinned to a tavern door. A parchment nailed to a tree. Passed from hand to hand like a curse. Wanted for murder, it would say. Or reward. 50 silver for the assassin with the crooked nose and scar on the brow. And just like that, your face, your tool, your weapon, your most guarded secret, became a beacon for every greedy idiot with a sword and nothing to lose. These weren't flattering portraits either. They didn't need to be perfect. Just close enough to make people paranoid. A long jaw, sharp eyes, a distinctive scar. That's all it took. And even if the drawing was wrong, if it resembled you just enough, it didn't matter. You were now every criminal in every village. Peasants didn't know the difference. Guards didn't ask questions. They saw the sketch, they saw you, and that was enough to draw steel. You couldn't walk through a market without eyes following you. Couldn't stop at a roadside fire without someone studying your profile in the flickering light, wondering if you matched the bounty that showed up last week. It didn't stop at drawings. Your name, whatever alias you were using when the job went wrong, became a ghost that followed you. A whisper in cities. A warning in villages. Keep an eye out for the one with the limp. That's him, I swear. I saw him in Pella 2 months ago, wearing a red scarf. Half the time it wasn't even true. People saw assassins in every traveler, in every shadow, but the fear was enough, and fear meant trouble. Fear meant people reaching for pitchforks and summoning local guards who hadn't had anything exciting to do in weeks. And you were excitement. Once your likeness was out there, hiding became a full-time job. You shaved your head. You grew a beard. You changed the way you walked, spoke, breathed. You smeared mud on your cheeks and pretended to be blind. You stuffed your clothes to change your build. You did anything, everything, to kill the person in the sketch. But it never fully worked. Because no matter how clever the disguise, someone always squinted. Someone always thought you looked familiar. And from there, it was only a matter of time before someone tested their suspicion with a blade. Your face wasn't yours anymore. It belonged to the world, to bounty hunters, to jailers, to gossips who pointed fingers with shaky certainty. And in a time where justice was swift and clumsy, being mistaken for yourself was enough to die for. You didn't get to age gracefully. You changed or you burned. Because the moment your mark lived long enough to remember your face, you stopped being a man and became a memory everyone wanted to erase. Succeed or fail, clients often sent a second assassin. The job wasn't finished until you disappeared too. That was the unspoken rule, the part they never wrote down, never admitted out loud. You were useful right up until the moment the target's breath stopped. After that, you were a loose end. A living, breathing liability, walking around with dangerous knowledge. Who ordered the killing, why, and how it was done. And in a world driven by fear, betrayal, and blood-soaked politics, that kind of knowledge didn't earn you respect. It earned you a death sentence, one you didn't even know had been signed. They didn't always send someone right away. Sometimes the blade came days later, weeks, even months after the job. Just enough time for you to start feeling safe. Just enough time to let your guard down, take your boots off, sleep through the night without a dagger tucked beneath your ribs. That's when it happened. A poisoned drink at the inn. A hooded figure waiting near the stables. A friendly face you hadn't seen in years. A fellow assassin from the old days, smiling just a little too wide. You'd feel the knife before the betrayal ever registered, because that's how they liked it. Quick, clean, no words. You disappeared just like your target did. Other times, they didn't even bother with subtlety. You'd return to collect your payment, and the client would greet you with a drink, a nod, and two men waiting behind the door. You did the job too well, they'd say. You asked the wrong questions. You saw something you shouldn't have. Or maybe they simply couldn't afford the risk. The same coin pouch they handed you would be used to pay the man who buried you. A full circle arrangement, efficient, brutal, predictable, if you'd been smart enough to see it coming. And it didn't matter if you were loyal, if you'd done a dozen jobs, kept every secret, vanished without a trace. Trust wasn't currency in this line of work. Paranoia was. The very thing that made you valuable. Your ability to get close, to kill quietly, to know things, made you a threat the moment the job was over. Because who's to say you wouldn't be bought by the other side? Who's to say you wouldn't get drunk, talk too much, fall in love, write something down? The client couldn't afford to wonder. They just acted. So you stopped trusting anyone. You never met the client in person if you could help it. You demanded half the pay up front and vanished the moment the job was done. No farewell, no second meeting, no congratulations. And even then, you never let your guard drop. Because the knife wasn't always in your hand. Sometimes it was in the hand of the person who had just praised your work, thanked you for your loyalty, and promised there would be more jobs in the future. There wouldn't be. There never were. Some contracts were traps. You'd walk into a target's chambers and find a dozen guards waiting to arrest a killer. Not a killer of their choosing, just a killer. You. It didn't matter whether the job was real or fabricated, whether the target was corrupt or innocent. Sometimes the contract was just bait, a noble trying to smoke out his enemies, a bishop staging a political spectacle, a king hoping to send a message. All they needed was someone with a reputation for quiet work and dirty hands, someone desperate enough to take the job, someone who wouldn't be missed when the trap snapped shut. You'd receive the usual offer: sealed scroll, strange coin, maybe a meeting in a dark alley with a cloaked figure who never gave a name. The details would be specific, too specific. Floor plans, guard rotations, poison recipes, everything tailored to make you believe this was legitimate. You'd do your prep, study the mark, plan the entry, the escape, every step carefully mapped. And when the night came, you'd slip into the manor or abbey or fortress ready to strike, only to find a dozen armored men waiting with torches and steel. Sometimes they'd pretend to be asleep just to watch how close you'd get before you realized. Sometimes the target was real, just too important to die. Killing them would have shifted power in ways no one wanted. So instead, you were the offering. A chance for the crown to say, "We've captured a would-be assassin." The people would cheer, justice would be served, and behind the scenes, your client, if there ever was one, would fade into the mist, unscathed, unnamed. You'd be paraded through the streets, a living warning to anyone else who thought about raising a blade in silence. If you were lucky, it ended quickly, a trial in name only, a confession beaten out of you for show, a rope, a platform, a final moment in front of a crowd who couldn't decide if they feared you or hated you more. If you weren't lucky, and you usually weren't, they'd keep you alive for a while. Ask questions they already knew the answers to. Use you as leverage in some political negotiation. Torture you for the entertainment of nobles who claimed to abhor violence but stayed for the finale. You weren't a man anymore. You were a prop in someone else's play. The worst part? You never knew which jobs were real and which were traps. The setup was always the same. Same coin, same promises, same quiet desperation in the client's voice. So you treated every contract like it might kill you, double-checked every route, watched every shadow, slept with one eye open for days, but it didn't always help, because sometimes the trap was too well laid, sometimes the betrayal was too deep, and sometimes you didn't walk into a kill. You walked into a performance, one where your role had been written for you, one where the ending had already been decided. Refusing a job wasn't safe. If someone asked and you declined, you were a liability, a talking liability. It didn't matter why you said no. Too dangerous, too public, too morally rotten, even for your blood-soaked hands. Once someone approached you with a name and a pouch of silver, you were already in too deep. They had seen your face, measured your reaction, and calculated what you might say, or worse, what you might remember. Saying no didn't wipe the slate clean. It just made you a threat that couldn't be controlled. And in a world ruled by power and paranoia, threats didn't get second chances. They got silenced. The trouble was, many of the people who hired assassins weren't killers themselves, not in the traditional sense. They were nobles, merchants, priests, spy masters. Dangerous in their own ways, but soft-handed and polished, terrified of being implicated in their own schemes. That's why they needed you. But they didn't just want someone who could do the job. They wanted someone who wouldn't leave behind a single ripple. Someone who'd kill the target and then vanish like mist. So if you said no, suddenly you were no longer useful. You were a risk sitting across from them with a head full of names and no intention of playing along. That meant you had to go. You might spot the danger early. The flicker in their eyes when you decline, the sudden shift in tone. You might even pretend to consider it, lie through your teeth, buy time. But eventually, the refusal would catch up to you. Maybe it came in the form of a poisoned drink the same night. Maybe a week later, on the road, you'd hear footsteps behind you and know they'd hired someone else. Or maybe, worst of all, they'd start spreading rumors. Let the world think you took the job anyway. Let your name be attached to a killing you didn't commit. Suddenly, both sides wanted you dead, the target's allies for trying, and the client for declining. You learned fast that some jobs weren't really offers. They were ultimatums in disguise. Say yes, and you might die trying. Say no, and you'd die for sure. You started developing instincts, feeling the tone of a meeting, reading between words, spotting the setups. But even those instincts couldn't save you every time. Sometimes you were just caught, cornered by a wealthy man in a wine-scented chamber who gave you a choice that wasn't a choice at all. The irony was brutal. For all the fear people had of assassins, you had even more fear of them, of their desperation, of their greed, of their need to clean up messes before they even happened. And when you tried to walk away from that, from the job, from the name, they didn't let you go. They couldn't. You weren't just someone who knew too much. You were a mirror of their worst sin. And the only way to shatter that reflection was to break you completely, quietly, permanently. Even if you survived the job, there were no benefits. You might go months without work or food. People like to imagine assassins as well-paid shadows, moving from one fat contract to the next, pockets jingling with blood money. But the truth was closer to misery than mastery. Killing was rare. More often, you waited, in silence, in hunger, in uncertainty. You sat in flea-bitten inns, nursing a single drink for hours, hoping the right kind of trouble would find you. You loitered in cities too dangerous to stay in and too desperate to leave. Some weeks, you had nothing but rumors. Some months, not even that. And when there was no work, no payment, and no promise, you had no backup. You couldn't just pick up odd jobs. You weren't exactly suited to sweeping stables or selling thread. You were the kind of man who made people uncomfortable even without a blade in your hand. The villagers didn't trust you. The guilds didn't want you. And you couldn't risk drawing attention by begging or stealing. Not unless you wanted to end up in a cell or worse, in a cage. So you learned to go without. You stretched crusts of bread across 3 days. You drank from wells that gave you fever. You learned to sleep cold and light and curled like an animal. Sometimes you took lesser work. Courier missions that involved slipping scrolls under doors or smuggling trinkets wrapped in rags. Not enough to live on, barely enough to keep you breathing. And even that was dangerous. Because the line between trusted errand boy and convenient scapegoat was paper thin. All it took was one missing message or one guard in a foul mood, and you were back to running, hiding, starving. You didn't get to build a reputation. You got to maintain a low profile and hope the right kind of evil still remembered your name. Clients were fickle. Some vanished after one job. Others got themselves executed, exiled, or poisoned before they could pay. And you were left in the ashes, forgotten. There was no pension, no guild fund, no coin trickling in from grateful hands. You didn't have savings. You didn't dare keep a hoard. Not unless you wanted to be robbed, tortured, or killed for it. What little you had was sewn into your clothes or buried in places you forgot the location of weeks later. And when the cold set in and the snow blocked roads and trade, work dried up entirely. No one wanted a noble dead when they couldn't flee the city themselves. You huddled in ruined barns, chewed stale beans, and cursed the silence of the world. You were a man trained to kill, forced to starve. Not because of some moral debt, but because death simply didn't pay consistently. Being an assassin meant you weren't just hunted, you were also forgotten. Until someone needed another job done. And then, like a ghost, you came crawling out of the dark, gaunt, filthy, desperate, for one more chance at silver and the temporary illusion of survival. Being an assassin in winter was brutal. Cold steel, freezing nights, and trails that couldn't be hidden in snow. Everything about the season worked against you. Your body stiffened in the cold, every joint a creaking hinge. The dagger at your side might as well have been a brick of ice when you reached for it with numb fingers. You couldn't rely on silence. Snow crunched beneath your boots, no matter how carefully you stepped. And the air carried sound for miles. A cough, a snapped twig, a breath you couldn't hold. Even the wind betrayed you, whipping your cloak at the worst moments or stealing your body heat with every gust. Targets didn't sleep alone in winter. Castles were tighter, walls sealed against the frost, fires always burning. Servants stayed in their quarters. Nobles doubled their guards, not just for fear of blades, but of sickness, of rebellion, of starvation. That meant more eyes, more ears, more hands ready to grab a weapon when a door creaked open at the wrong hour. An escape? Forget it. Snow turned every footprint into a road map. You could vanish into the woods, and they'd still follow your trail like hounds after a hare. Even if you ran for miles, someone would always know where you'd been. Food was harder to come by. Inns were filled with people trying to stay warm, meaning you stood out if you didn't talk, didn't drink, didn't shiver like everyone else. And sleeping rough was a gamble. You didn't just risk being found, you risked freezing to death before morning. You curled up in ditches and haylofts, wrapped in rags, teeth clenched so tight they cracked. You hugged your blade for warmth, and some nights you wondered if the cold would kill you before the next job did. Poison lost its edge in the winter. Meals were simpler, fewer ingredients to hide bitter herbs or strange smells. Drinks were hot, and the steam carried every scent. Nobles trusted their food tasters like lifelines. And if the stew went cold too fast, the target sent it back. Nothing about winter made killing easier. It just made you slower, hungrier, colder, and more desperate. Worse still, you were more visible. Black clothes against white snow. Your breath fogging the air. Your body hunched against the cold like a beast ready to pounce or flee. People noticed you in winter. Guards noticed you. Children noticed you. And if you were noticed, you were already in danger. Winter didn't kill with fanfare. It chipped away at you, night after night, breath after breath. You lost your edge, your patience, your instincts. You made mistakes. And in your line of work, one mistake was all it took. You didn't bleed out on the snow most of the time. You simply didn't wake up. Or you froze with your eyes open, watching the trees sway above you. No fire, no shelter, no glory. Just cold and silence and the sound of your own name being forgotten. Winter didn't have to hunt you. It just had to wait. You worked in the same shadows as pickpockets and smugglers, but they wouldn't hesitate to sell you out for coin. You weren't part of some brotherhood of the underworld. There was no code among cutthroats, no mutual respect among those who lived by night. The alleyways were full of men and women who'd slit your throat as quickly as they'd shake your hand, especially if they thought it might earn them favor or gold or a cleaner conscience. To them, you weren't a fellow traveler. You were bad luck wrapped in leather and secrets. And if they knew your trade, if they suspected you were the kind of person who got paid to kill quietly, they'd either avoid you, or worse, report you. Thieves and smugglers might have shared your hiding spots, your escape routes, your fences and contacts. But that didn't make them allies. You were different. They could claim poverty, desperation, hunger. You killed for money. That put you in a category they didn't want to be near when the sheriff came knocking. If a thief got caught, maybe they lost a finger. Maybe they got a flogging. But harboring an assassin? That brought the rope, or the fire, or a bounty big enough to make a man turn in his own brother. So when word got around that you were in town, even whispered, even rumored, you could feel the air change. Doors that once opened stayed shut. Eyes followed you longer. Friends of friends disappeared. And if you did need help, a guide through the slums, a quiet place to rest, a message delivered, you paid double, triple if the job went long. But even gold didn't buy loyalty, because the same coin you paid them could just as easily come from the other side. All it took was one question from a guard, one whispered offer from a noble servant, one flash of silver, and suddenly that smuggler you thought was an ally was pointing the blade at you. Not out of hatred, just business, just survival. You learned not to rely on anyone. Not the drunk who promised you a safe room above the inn, not the girl who swore her father wouldn't ask questions, not even the boy who helped you climb the wall last winter. Everyone had a price, and your life was worth more in pieces than it was in your hands. You didn't keep company. You didn't share stories. You didn't drink from mugs. You didn't pour yourself. Because one whisper from the wrong mouth, one glance at the wrong moment, and you were a name on a list, a bag of bones dumped in a river, or a reward being counted out in front of a cheering crowd. In the world of thieves, everyone stole from someone. But you stole peace, power, life, and no one, not even criminals, wanted to be seen standing too close to that kind of curse. Love was weakness. Affection was danger. Anyone who got close became a target or a hostage. The life you lived didn't make room for softness. You didn't come home to warm embraces or whispered comfort. You came home to silence, to weapons tucked under your mattress, to the kind of loneliness that carved its name into your ribs. Because the moment you let someone in, they became leverage. And leverage in your world meant death, slow, messy, and used against you in the worst possible way. It started small, a glance too long, a night spent in the same place twice, a conversation that felt like more than a transaction. You told yourself it was nothing, just company, just warmth. But that's how it always started. And once it did, you were already slipping, already thinking about them when you should be studying roots, watching shadows, listening for the sound of betrayal creeping up behind you. You started hesitating, not because you were scared, but because you didn't want them to pay for your sins. Because they always paid. Whether it was a lover, a friend, a child, anyone tied to you was fair game. Rivals would use them. Clients would threaten them. Guards would squeeze them for names. And even if they didn't talk, even if they were brave, it didn't matter. Just knowing you was a sentence. Maybe they'd get dragged into court. Maybe they'd vanish one night and turn up in a ditch. Or maybe they'd just disappear from your life without a word, terrified of what your presence would bring. So you learned to cut ties before they could form. You kept your distance. You lied about your name, your past, your face. You pushed people away with silence or cruelty, whichever worked faster. And when someone tried to get close, when they saw through the ragged cloak and the tired eyes, you ran. Not because you didn't want it, but because you did. And wanting meant caring, and caring meant blood. You didn't get to have the life other people did. No family waiting at the hearth, no hand to hold when the night felt too long. You had ghosts. You had names you never spoke aloud. You had a knife where your heart should have been, and the knowledge that you put it there yourself, because it was safer that way. And maybe on the rarest nights, when the world was quiet and your hands stopped shaking long enough to close your eyes, you dreamed. You dreamed of what it would be like to be held, to be known, to be loved without fear. But you always woke up with a start, clutching the blade beside you, breath tight in your chest. Because assassins don't love. They can't. Not if they want to survive. Love makes you human, and being human gets you killed. The church didn't just condemn you, they actively hunted you. And if they caught you, the punishment was biblical. To them, you weren't just a sinner, you were a threat to the divine order. A man who killed without king, army, or holy blessing. You weren't part of a war or justice or the Lord's work. You were a shadow, a blasphemy, a walking rebuke of everything they preached from the pulpit. And that made you more dangerous than any warlord. You answered to no one, feared no scripture, and slipped through the cracks where doctrine held no sway. That terrified them. So they made it their mission to burn you out of existence. Every city had its watchers, monks in the street, confessors in the alleys, friars who asked too many questions about strangers with quiet steps. And if your name reached the wrong ears, if your reputation preceded you even by rumor, they wouldn't wait for proof. The Inquisition didn't knock politely. They dragged you from your bed, chained and half naked, and marched you through the streets so that every pious soul could spit and pray over your cursed body. The church didn't want your death. They wanted your humiliation. They wanted you broken, repenting, screaming for forgiveness so everyone else could sleep easier. They didn't ask why you killed. They didn't care. Maybe your target was a tyrant. Maybe the client was a bishop's rival. It didn't matter. You had shed blood without prayer. You had spilled life without asking permission. And for that, there could be no mercy. You weren't given a trial. You were given a list of sins, half of which you'd never heard before, and told to confess before your tongue was torn out. You weren't even considered a heretic. Heretics had beliefs. You were just filth, a vessel of violence that needed to be purified with fire, steel, and public example. Some clerics whispered of redemption, of forgiveness for even the darkest souls, but not for you. You were beneath salvation. The ones who preached love turned their faces away. The ones who preached fire sharpened their tools. You became a lesson, an image carved in stained glass. The hooded killer flayed alive before the altar, a reminder to the faithful that God saw everything, and that the church's justice was not confined to the next world. You learned to avoid holy places. You stepped wide around cathedrals, kept your head down when bells rang. You never stayed in a town long during feast days or pilgrimages. Too many eyes, too many watchers with clean hands and righteous fury. Because the church didn't need evidence, they only needed fear. And fear was everywhere. You saw it in the way people crossed themselves when they met your gaze, in the way priests blessed doorways after you passed through, in the way scripture curled from their mouths like knives. To them, you weren't just damned, you were contagious. And they would rather see your bones scattered in a sanctified pit than let you walk the earth another day. One drink too many, one story too loud, and suddenly you're being dragged out of a tavern by angry villagers. That was all it took. A slip of the tongue, a careless boast, a laugh that carried too far. Assassins were supposed to vanish into the crowd, not become part of the evening's entertainment. But even shadows get lonely. Even the most silent killers need warmth now and then. A mug of something strong, a fire crackling in a hearth, a room full of faces that weren't hostile for once. It could feel safe. Safer than it was. That was the trap. Comfort. The illusion of belonging. You'd take one drink, then two. Someone would ask about the scar on your cheek or the strange dagger on your hip. And against your better judgment, you'd answer. Maybe you didn't mean to confess. Maybe you thought you were being clever. Maybe it felt good to talk, to be seen. You'd skirt the truth, wrap it in humor, hide it in half facts. I knew a man once, you'd say. slipped into a bishop's bedchamber and left without a sound. And they'd laugh, or pretend to, but they never forgot. Not a single word. Because nobody forgets when the quiet stranger starts telling stories about dead nobles and poisoned wine, and once someone got suspicious, it spread fast. A few murmured questions, a couple of glances. One person slips outside. Next thing you know, the door bursts open and the mood shifts. It goes quiet. Too quiet. Chairs scrape the floor. Someone steps in front of the exit. You reach for your blade and realize too late it's gone. Or worse, it won't help. Because this isn't a duel. It's a mob. A dozen villagers fueled by fear and ale, looking to purge the evil that walked into their tavern with a crooked smile and a past full of blood. They didn't care if the story was true. All they needed was the possibility. In a world where justice was rarely seen and evil often wore crowns, the idea of punishing someone was intoxicating. And if that someone was a stranger with too many secrets, all the better. They'd drag you out by your cloak, kicking, screaming, bleeding. Not to a cell, but to the square. There was no trial, just torches, ropes, and a priest too eager to bless the violence. You learned quickly, never drink too much, never laugh too loud, never talk about your past, because every word was a weapon turned against you. Assassins didn't get to have memories. They didn't get to tell stories. They were stories, dark ones, whispered at night to scare children and soothe the guilt of peasants who thought they could spot evil when they saw it. So you drank alone, if at all. You spoke in short phrases, lied about everything, and kept your back to the wall. Because the only thing sharper than your blade was a tongue loosened by wine. And once yours slipped, no steel in the world could save you. The denser the population, the more eyes watching. In a medieval city, anonymity was almost impossible. People like to think a crowd offers cover, that you can disappear among the masses, just another hooded figure moving through the filth and fog. But that illusion only lasted a moment. In reality, cities were the worst place for someone like you. Every alley had a beggar who saw too much. Every tavern had a regular who noticed new faces. Every market stall was run by someone who gossiped for sport. You couldn't take 5 steps without being sized up, whispered about, or questioned. There were no secrets in a city, only slow leaks waiting to drown you. You walked differently, even when you tried not to. You didn't fidget. You didn't linger. Your eyes stayed sharp, and your hands never strayed far from your belt. People noticed that, guards especially. They were trained to look for tension, and you radiated it. They could smell it, like blood under the perfume of the street. And they weren't the only ones. Children watched you with wide, suspicious eyes. Bakers frowned when you passed twice in the same morning. Even the rats gave you space, because you didn't belong. And in a medieval city, not belonging was a kind of death sentence. Worse still, cities were tight, walled, trapped. If something went wrong, there was nowhere to run. You couldn't disappear into the trees or vanish across a riverbank. Every gate was guarded. Every bridge was watched. Word traveled faster than your feet. If your job made noise, if your target screamed, if blood spilled in the wrong place, someone would run to the church bells or the watchtower, and suddenly the entire block knew. And once the guards came looking, they didn't need your name. Just a vague description and the will to make examples. Tall man, worn cloak, wrong kind of silence. That was enough. Dozens of hands would point in your direction, eager for favor or coin. You could be innocent of the job, guilty of dozens of others, or simply unlucky. Didn't matter. You'd be dragged into the square like any other criminal, You couldn't trust safe houses. You couldn't trust informants. The very people who promised you shelter were often paid to turn you in. The streets turned on you the second you got too comfortable. One warm bed, one friendly landlord, one conversation in a language you forgot to fake. That's all it took. The city swallowed you, not with jaws, but with noise, light, and pressure. And then it spat you out for the crows. In the countryside, you could vanish. In the forest, you were a ghost. But in the city, you were a sickness everyone wanted gone. Even when you walked with your head down, your hood drawn tight, and your footsteps soft, you still felt it. The pressure, the narrowing, the walls inching closer, the crowd watching, the silence that meant someone was listening. Cities weren't protection. Cities were cages. And once the gates closed behind you, you just prayed you'd make it out before they noticed the wolf in the crowd. You didn't live in secret chambers. You squatted in holes, abandoned barns, or shared hay with livestock. The stories always make it sound glamorous. Hidden trap doors, candlelit hideouts behind bookshelves, layers carved into stone cellars beneath the city. But real assassins didn't have secret sanctuaries. They had damp corners that smelled like mold and manure. You curled up in places even thieves avoided. Under bridges, behind collapsed walls, in the rafters of barns where rats ran over your legs at night and chickens pecked your fingers when you reached for food. You learned to stay still for hours, even days, just to avoid being seen. You learned to sleep with your cloak over your mouth so your breath didn't frost in the air and give you away. There was no warmth, no luxury. You couldn't risk fires. The light would draw eyes, the smoke would bring questions. So you froze, through winters that cracked your skin and curled your toes into brittle knots. Your bones ached from the cold, your muscles cramped from sleeping in a crouch, and your back felt like it belonged to someone twice your age. Every morning was a gamble. Would you wake up alive or stiff and blue with frostbite? Another unclaimed corpse no one would bother to bury. Food was worse. You didn't cook meals, you scavenged scraps, bread crusts tossed in the mud, bits of fat shaved off someone else's butchered meat. And when the pickings were lean, and they were always lean, you chewed boiled roots or stole feed meant for livestock. You envied the rats sometimes. At least they lived close to the hearth. At least they didn't need to lie about who they were. You, on the other hand, lived every second as a ghost, pretending to be a shepherd, a beggar, a sick relative who just needed one night in the barn. Lying wasn't a skill, it was your shelter. And if you got sick, there was no healer, no priest with mercy. You wrapped yourself in rags and waited to get better, or die. If your stomach turned or your head swam, you didn't go looking for help. You crawled deeper into your hole, clutching your blade like it could cut through fever. You prayed to gods you didn't believe in, that it wasn't the pox or something worse. Because if you were found, shivering and weak, people didn't offer blankets. They offered accusations. They thought you were cursed, dangerous, contagious. And in a way, you were. You weren't some robed figure perched on a Gothic rooftop, watching the world burn from above. You were beneath it, in the mud, the rot, the ruin. You were the man who slept on straw wet with rat piss, who rubbed dirt on his face to look more forgettable, who lived worse than the creatures he killed for coin. There was no glory in it, just survival, and even that was temporary. Every night was half sleep, half paranoia. You learned to rest with one eye open and a hand on your knife. Real sleep, the kind where your body forgets the weight of the world and your breath deepens without fear, was a luxury long gone. You couldn't afford it, not in the inns where knives were cheap and your face might be recognized, not in the woods where wolves weren't the only predators, not in the barns the ruins, the haylofts, or the riverbanks where you curled up like a dog and prayed for morning. You never let your back face the door. You never closed your eyes fully unless you'd booby-trapped the entrance or paid someone even more paranoid than you, to keep watch. You didn't dream. Dreams were dangerous. They made you slow, soft, human. You trained yourself to wake at the smallest sound. A creak, a footstep, the shift of wind against a shutter. And if something was off, even slightly, you were upright in a breath, blade in hand, body tensed for a fight that might never come, but someday would. Because someone was always looking for you. A vengeful brother, a betrayed noble, a former client who didn't like the loose thread you represented. Or worse, someone just like you, hired to finish what you started and erase you in the process. You tried to find comfort in routine, the way you placed your boots, the rhythm of sharpening your knife, the whispered checks for exits in the dark. But comfort was an illusion too, because no matter how careful you were, no matter how deep the hiding place, there was always that creeping certainty that this night, this exact night, would be the one where your luck finally snapped. Maybe you'd overslept by a breath. Maybe someone you paid to keep a secret had changed their mind. Maybe the guards had decided to sweep the area. You never knew. You just lay there, heartbeat like a drum in your throat, waiting for the knock, the scrape, the breath not your own. And sometimes it came. Sometimes it was a rat. Sometimes it was a priest's boot. Sometimes it was nothing at all, and you'd bolt upright in a cold sweat, heart racing from a sound that wasn't real. But you couldn't risk assuming. Because in your life, paranoia wasn't a symptom. It was survival. So you learned to sleep in pieces, minutes stolen in back corners, light dozes between shifts in the dark. You learned the sound of safe silence. You memorized how long it took your body to leap from slumber to attack. You kept your blade in your palm beneath your cloak, even in the dead of winter, even when your fingers ached with cold. Because sleep wasn't rest. Sleep was vulnerability. And vulnerability, in your world, was a death sentence signed in the hours before dawn. There was no guild to rescue you, no brotherhood of shadows. If you got caught, you died alone. Despite what the old tales might say of secret networks and loyal assassins whispering code words in taverns, you knew better. There was no safety net, no hidden temple where someone would light a candle for you, no masked brother sprinting across rooftops to break your chains. You were on your own from the first blade to the last breath. If your luck ran out, if your face got recognized, if the guards burst through the door at midnight, or the client turned you in for coin or penance, no one was coming. The only backup you ever had was the rusted knife under your belt, and maybe a few seconds of warning if your instincts didn't fail you first. And when you were caught, and it was when, not if, you didn't get a clean execution, you got dragged. Through mud, through stone, through jeering crowds who smelled your fear and fed on it like carrion birds. There was no honor in how they killed you. There was no warrior's send-off. You were a curiosity, a warning, a twisted performance. The gallows didn't wait for trial. The executioner didn't ask your name. The priest didn't offer comfort, because the world didn't want to understand you. It wanted to watch you burn. Maybe you tried to talk your way out of it. Maybe you swore innocence or told them the truth, that you weren't the only one, that someone hired you, that the real monsters wore silk robes and sat behind gold-plated doors. But it didn't matter. No one believed assassins, not even when they told the truth, because the truth, coming from your mouth, sounded like another lie. People would rather believe in heroes and villains than in desperate men doing awful things just to survive another week. You thought once that maybe someone would remember you, a grateful client, an old lover, a mentor from the shadows, cloaked in silence, who'd arrive at the last moment with a knife in hand and vengeance in his eyes. But those fantasies died young. Whoever taught you disappeared the moment you stopped being useful. Whoever paid you didn't want their name dragged into the light. And anyone who ever cared for you either left or ended up with a blade in their own back because of it. So when they dragged you to the block or strung you up by the wrists, you didn't scream for help. You didn't expect rescue. You bit your tongue, clenched your teeth, and stared death in the eye alone. Because that was the life. You were forgotten by design, disposable by profession. The world only cared about the blood you spilled, not the story that brought you to the killing. And when it was your turn to bleed, there was no hand reaching for yours. Just the crowd, the rope, the fire, and the silence where your name used to be. Assassins were feared until they were caught, and mocked as they were executed. That's the cruel joke no one tells you when you pick up the blade. People whisper your name in alleys, spin ghost stories about your work, cross themselves when you pass in the market. For a time, fear is your armor. The unknown keeps you alive. You're not a man, you're a shadow, a legend, a knife in the dark. But it only lasts as long as they don't know who you are. The moment you're unmasked, cornered, or dragged into the light, that fear turns into something uglier. Contempt, disgust, laughter. You weren't a demon. You were just a man, dirty, tired, gaunt, bleeding. They expected sleek robes and flashing daggers. They got a shivering figure in torn clothes with piss-soaked boots and a haunted look. And the crowd? Oh, they fed on it. The same people who shivered at rumors of your killings now lined up to spit at you, to throw rotten fruit, to call you coward, rat, monster. Because fear was fragile, and once broken, it curdled into something vicious, something hungry. The guards liked to put on a show. They dragged you through the square like a trophy, laughing, jeering. They told children you were the devil, then let them pelt you with stones. You weren't treated like a professional killer. You were treated like a joke, an animal, a lesson. They shaved your head, chained your arms, and made sure you looked weak when they marched you past the church steps. And when the crowd saw you, just a man after all, they weren't afraid anymore. They were entertained. Even the priest got in on it. He recited scripture, not to save your soul, but to remind everyone that the wrath of heaven looked just like a man dying in the mud. The executioner didn't bother with clean cuts. They made it slow, public, memorable. A few lashes first, a few pulled teeth. Whatever they thought would make the people sleep easier. Because you weren't just dying, you were being erased. The fear they once felt, that was a mistake they had to correct, with laughter, with punishment, with public shame. And you didn't beg, you didn't explain. You just stared out at the same faces that once feared your silence and now laughed at your pain. You realized then that fear never lasted. It was a mask people wore when they didn't understand something. Once they saw you clearly, once they knew you could be beaten, chained, stripped of mystery, they didn't need to be afraid anymore. They just needed to feel powerful. So they watched, and they cheered, and you became a story told at night. Not a warning, but a punchline. Not the man who killed barons and bishops, but the one who cried when they set fire to his cloak. Fear made you invisible. Laughter made you forgotten. And in the end, you didn't die a legend. You died a spectacle. You could be hunted just for fitting a vague description. Wrong hood, wrong face, wrong village, dead. That was the terrifying part. You didn't even need to be you to die like an assassin. Maybe a baron's son had been murdered in his sleep. Maybe someone whispered assassin and pointed at a figure slipping through the fog. That's all it took. No trial, no questions. Just a hue and cry. And suddenly, you were the devil in the crowd. You didn't have to be guilty. You just had to be nearby. Villagers weren't trained investigators. They weren't looking for proof. They were looking for someone to hang, someone to make the fear go away. And fear made them blind. If a guard caught a glimpse of someone in a cloak, if a child claimed to see someone climbing a wall, if a priest felt something off during morning prayers, they'd start a hunt. And if you happened to be passing through that same village, wearing the wrong color, speaking with a strange accent, keeping too quiet for their liking, that was it. You were their answer. A neat, blood-stained solution. You could feel it shift. The stares, the tension. The market grew quieter when you passed. The tavern closed its doors early. You weren't welcome, but worse than that, you were watched. And then someone whispered. Then someone shouted. Then someone threw a stone. And the next thing you knew, you were being chased through muddy streets by people who didn't even know your name. All they knew was that someone had to pay for the killing. And you looked close enough. Sometimes you were caught by guards who weren't sure what you'd done, only that a noble had screamed for justice and they needed someone to blame. They asked you where you were 2 nights ago. You told the truth. They called it a lie. They held your arms too tight, broke your fingers just to see if you flinched like a guilty man. And once you were in chains, there was no escaping the story they'd already written. You were the killer because someone needed to be. And no one was going to look further once the noose was ready. Other times it was worse. You watched another man die in your place. A traveler with your build, a thief with your cloak, a beggar who looked too much like you in the dark. You wanted to warn them, to say something, to stop it, but you didn't. Because speaking up meant dying too. You watched the wrong man burn while people cheered, and you disappeared into the forest with his face etched into your nightmares. You learned to change your walk, change your voice, change everything. Because one wrong feature, one wrong moment, one wrong village, and the next gallows would have your name, even if no one knew who you really were. Your corpse might be mutilated, paraded, or displayed. You weren't just killed, you were unmade. Death wasn't the end for someone like you. It was only the beginning of a new kind of punishment, one meant for crowds, for sermons, for scaring children into obedience. The execution wasn't enough. They needed to make a statement. You had crossed a line, not just legal, but spiritual, moral, cultural. You'd lived as a shadow, taken lives in silence, answered to no crown or cross. So when they finally got you, they made sure the world remembered. Not who you were, but what you represented. Fear, defiance, and the illusion of control. That illusion had to be shattered. They didn't just hang you. They flayed your skin or cut out your tongue. They dragged your body behind horses through the streets, limbs limp, blood streaking the cobbles like a trail of shame. Your hands might be nailed to the town gate, a warning for any who dared follow your path. Your head, mounted on a spike, stared down at the crowds until the birds took your eyes. And people watched. They came for it. They brought their children. They told stories about what you did and how you screamed. They made it entertainment, holy theater, righteous revenge dressed in blood and rope. You weren't buried, you weren't blessed, you were left left to rot in the square, left to swing in the wind, jaw hanging open like a puppet with its strings cut, left to remind everyone what happens to those who step outside the line. Some places wouldn't even let your bones rest. They dug them up months later, burned them, scattered the ashes, cursed the earth where you died. You weren't just removed from the world. You were erased from it. And in a way, that was worse than death, because a clean kill would have been enough for justice. But this wasn't justice. It was ritual. It was exorcism. The act of turning your death into a story they could control. You weren't allowed to die as a man. You were turned into a symbol of evil, of corruption, of godless violence. And then they tore that symbol apart, piece by piece, until only the horror remained. You knew this, of course. Every time you took a contract, every time you crept through a noble's window or stirred poison into wine, you knew the cost. You had seen others suffer it. Assassins you once shared a roof with, whose screams echoed through castle squares before the rope snapped their necks. You'd even heard rumors of a man whose body was sealed into a wall while still breathing, cursed to die forgotten behind the altar he once defiled. So you kept your face hidden. You made sure no one ever truly knew your name, because the worst fate for someone like you wasn't to be hunted. It was to be recognized, to be caught, killed, and turned into a spectacle that stripped away every shred of secrecy and left you naked before the world. Not feared, not respected, just broken, burned, and remembered only for how you ended. Assassins weren't buried with respect. You were tossed in ditches, unmarked, forgotten. No procession, no eulogy, no grave to be wept over. Your body, if it was even recovered, was treated like rot, something to be discarded, not honored. You didn't earn prayers. You earned disgust. A killer had no place in consecrated ground, no resting spot beneath stone or cross. The priests wouldn't touch you. The gravediggers did their work quickly, usually at night, shoveling you into the earth like spoiled meat. Sometimes they didn't even bother with dirt. They just dumped your corpse into a ravine or let the crows do what they do best. There were no mourners. No one lit candles for your soul. Because to mourn you, someone had to know you, and no one ever truly did. You had no friends, no family willing to claim your bones. Anyone who had once cared, if anyone ever had long since been pushed away, scared off, or buried themselves. Maybe someone had loved you once. Maybe you had a name someone whispered in secret, but that name was drowned beneath the titles they gave you after death: murderer, shadow, monster, sin. And you didn't just die alone, you vanished. The world swallowed you without blinking. Your life's work, the contracts fulfilled, the names erased. The corridors crept through in silence. None of it mattered. You left behind no legacy, no story passed down with reverence or awe. If they remembered you at all, it was as a warning. A dark tale told in hushed voices around the fire. He killed a bishop once, slid through the window like mist. But the guards caught him in the stables, strung him up with his own rope. That was the closest thing to a remembrance you'd get, a butchered version of a night you lived, twisted into a fable no one really believed. In a world obsessed with lineage, name, and afterlife, you were nothing. A smudge on the record. A secret cleaned up and disposed of. And the worst part? You couldn't even leave behind a stone to mark where you fell. The dirt didn't remember you. The wind didn't whisper your story. You were a life erased in full, as if you'd never drawn breath. You watched nobles get funerals with banners and bells, priests buried in robes and gold, even thieves laid to rest with a few tears and a bit of bread. But not you. You didn't die with dignity. You didn't leave the world with anything to your name. You died as you lived, in the dark. And in the end, not even the soil claimed you kindly. You weren't buried. You were discarded. And no one mourns a shadow. Pull off the perfect hit, and suddenly everyone wants to know who you are and where to find you. Success didn't bring you prestige. It brought attention. And for someone in your line of work, that was fatal. You weren't supposed to stand out. You were supposed to disappear. But a high-profile kill? A nobleman poisoned in his guarded chamber, a baron found with his throat open despite 4 locked doors. That kind of thing made noise. And noise drew eyes. The kind of eyes you spent your life avoiding. Clients whispered your name with admiration. At first, they passed it along like a secret, a token of power. He's the one who did it. But every whisper carved a new mark into your back. Because the more people knew you existed, the more likely someone wanted you dead. Not because of what you'd done, but because of what you could do. You became a risk, a living secret, a tool that couldn't be controlled once it proved too effective. And powerful people hated loose ends. You could feel it after a big job, the change, the looks that lingered longer, the sudden silence when you walked into a room, the shift in tone from the man who handed you your payment. There was always that pause, that weight in the air, as if they were deciding whether it was smarter to pay you or remove you, because dead men don't talk. Dead men can't be blackmailed. Dead men can't be bribed to kill again. It wasn't just clients. Rivals came sniffing too. Other killers, guards, mercenaries hired to erase you quietly. Sometimes it was about silencing a threat. Sometimes it was pride. Someone wanted to prove they could take out the best. Your success became a challenge, a bounty in its own right. You weren't just a tool anymore. You were a target with value attached. The more perfect the kill, the more imperfect your odds of surviving the aftermath. And hiding became harder. Your face, once forgotten in crowds, was now sketched in dirt and whispered in taverns. Your methods, the things that kept you alive, became traps. Every alley you once used was watched. Every fence you trusted started asking too many questions. You couldn't even enjoy the coins you earned because spending them made you visible. So you fled, again and again, changed names, burned contacts, slept less, trusted no one. Every step forward in your reputation became another reason to stay on the run. That was the irony of it. You did your job flawlessly. You left no witnesses. You escaped unseen. And still, you lost. Because the better you got, the more they noticed. And the more they noticed, the faster the walls closed in. In this world, success wasn't a ladder. It was a spotlight. And standing in it meant you were already marked. You didn't inspire apprentices. You scared people into silence. No legacy, no story, just dread. In a world that worshipped warriors and honored knights, there was no admiration reserved for a man who crept through shadows and killed without warning. You weren't a hero. You weren't even a cautionary tale. You were a stain, something people pretended not to see, something they swept under the rug while they clutched their children close and whispered prayers to keep the likes of you away. No one looked up to an assassin. No one wanted to follow in your footsteps. Not because it was too hard, but because it was too empty. There were no schools for your kind. No teachings passed down from master to student. The rare few who tried didn't survive long enough to become mentors. You had no guild, no banner, no guiding code, only instinct, desperation, and a long list of names to forget. And even if some half-starved orphan thought they could learn from you, you'd push them away. Because taking on a protege wasn't noble. It was dangerous. They'd slow you down. They'd die, or worse, they'd talk. And if they talked, they'd bring every blade in the kingdom to your door. The truth was, nobody mourned the passing of a killer, and nobody wanted to be one. The work didn't promise glory. It promised solitude, sickness, and a long, slow spiral into paranoia. You were feared, yes, but only in the same way people fear fire when it escapes the hearth. They didn't marvel at your skill. They flinched at your presence. You walked into a room and killed conversation. You asked a question and people forgot how to breathe. Because if you were nearby, that meant someone was going to die. And no one wanted to be the next one added to the list, whether you were there for them or not. Even after you were gone, you weren't remembered with interest. Your name, if spoken at all, was wrapped in shame and suspicion. No stories of cleverness or triumph, just hushed tones and sideways glances. The kind of memory people bury deep, like a sin they once watched happen and did nothing to stop. Some might claim they saw you once, the hooded figure by the well, the man who didn't cast a shadow. But even that was more about frightening children than preserving history. And so you faded. You didn't get a legacy, a family line, a place in the song of your people. You got forgotten. On purpose. Because remembering you meant acknowledging that someone like you ever existed. And no one wanted that. Not the noble you served, not the city you protected from its enemies, not the people you terrified into silence. You weren't a chapter. You were a footnote, and even that got torn out. No one wanted your life. No one wanted your name. They just wanted to be sure no one like you ever showed up again. Once you were in, there was no out. Stopping meant someone would stop you first. Assassins didn't retire. They vanished, died, or were silenced by the same blades they once carried. The life wasn't a job. It was a sentence. The moment you took your first life for coin, you stepped into a world that didn't allow mercy, rest, or exit. You could walk away from the work, but the work didn't walk away from you. Your face, your skills, your silence, they made you valuable and dangerous. Which meant as soon as you tried to leave, someone somewhere had a reason to make sure you never spoke again. Maybe you told yourself you'd do one more job. Just one. Enough coin to disappear to the mountains or sail south under a new name. But that final job never stayed final. The silver was never enough. And even if it was, someone always came knocking. A former client with another small favor. A rival who thought you knew too much. A noble who'd heard rumors about your past and wanted to ensure it stayed buried. There was no such thing as clean hands. Once you killed for a living, your hands stayed stained. And everyone could see it. And you couldn't exactly change professions. What would you become? A baker with a 1,000-yard stare? A farmer who flinched at every dog's bark? You weren't built for normal life anymore. The paranoia never left. The blade never left your side. Every creak in the floorboards, every stranger's glance, every sudden silence in a crowded street. It all felt like the start of an ambush. Even if no one was chasing you, your body believed they were. You couldn't relax, couldn't trust, couldn't live like other men. And worst of all, the killing changed you. You became efficient, detached. It stopped bothering you, then started comforting you. Taking a life was the one thing you were good at, the one thing that felt natural. So when someone threatened you or insulted you or looked at you wrong, you started thinking like an assassin again. You didn't argue, you calculated. Escape routes, pressure points, timing. It wasn't a choice anymore. It was reflex. And reflex didn't care about your promise to turn over a new leaf. So even if you told yourself you were done, no more contracts, no more blood, you kept the knife under your pillow. You still watched shadows in the corners of rooms. Because deep down, you knew the truth. The killing never stopped. It just changed shape. You didn't get to retire. You got to run. And when you finally slowed down, someone else, younger, hungrier, more desperate, would come to collect the silence you owed. Because in this world, the only way out was a shallow grave. And even that wasn't guaranteed to stay shut. Years of paranoia, silence, and blood-stained work messed with your mind. You didn't know who you were anymore. At first, it was just part of the job, the lying, the disguises, the shifting names. You became whoever you needed to be, a drunk farmer, a passing merchant, a silent monk on pilgrimage. You wore masks like second skins, and at first, it was clever, strategic, useful. But over time, those masks started to blur together. You couldn't remember your real voice. You caught yourself answering to names that weren't yours. You looked in the mirror and didn't recognize the eyes staring back. Solitude didn't help. You couldn't trust anyone, so you didn't speak unless you had to. Days passed in silence, then weeks, then months. You started talking to yourself in whispers, just to remember the shape of your own voice. But even that felt strange, like someone else was speaking through your mouth. You thought you were in control, that the job hadn't touched the core of you, but it had. Slowly, methodically, like water wearing down stone. You began to forget small things, where you were, what day it was, whether the blood on your hands was from yesterday's job or one from years ago, and the nightmares. They came whether you were guilty or not. Sometimes you saw the faces, the ones who fought back or didn't deserve it, or just looked at you like they knew. Sometimes you dreamed of being chased, not by guards, but by the people who hired you. Faces without names, names without faces, always coming closer. You'd wake up clawing at your chest, convinced someone was sitting on top of you, blade already halfway in. But it was just you. Just the weight of what you'd become pressing down on your ribs like armor made of ghosts. You began to see things that weren't there. Or maybe they were. A shadow moving just a little too deliberately. A whisper behind a closed door. A figure standing at the end of a road that vanished when you blinked. Paranoia became your only companion. And the worst part? You needed it. Because the day you relaxed, the day you stopped checking over your shoulder, that was the day you died. So you leaned into it. Let it hollow you out. Let it become your compass. If your instinct screamed that someone was following you, you didn't ask questions. You ran. Eventually, you couldn't remember what you were before the killing, before the masks and the poison and the rope burns around your wrists. Did you have a family? A real name? A place you called home? You told yourself you did once, but that life felt like a story someone else had told you. And now, you were just a knife with legs, a shadow with no roots. And every day, you wondered if the people you killed took pieces of you with them, if maybe, after enough kills, there wouldn't be anything left. Just a body moving on instinct, waiting for the moment when even the blade forgets who holds it. Rain ruined your plans. Wind carried your scent. Snow left footprints. Nature betrayed you constantly. The weather wasn't just an inconvenience. It was a full-time enemy. It didn't care about your precision or your timing. It didn't care about the risk you took scaling a castle wall in the dark, or the days you spent waiting in the woods for the perfect moment. The skies opened, and everything fell apart. Rain soaked your cloak until it dragged at your shoulders like dead weight. It made your boots slip on stone. It filled your poison vials with water and smeared dirt across the blade you'd spent hours sharpening. You couldn't climb, you couldn't sneak, and worst of all, you couldn't hear. Every drop masked the sound of someone approaching, or worse, someone already watching. The wind wasn't better. It shifted constantly, and with it, your scent. Dogs that should have been asleep suddenly started growling. Horses snorted in the dark. You thought you were downwind, invisible, silent, until a gust turned on you and your cover vanished. The wind carried your sweat, your breath, even the faint metallic tang of blood that clung to your hands no matter how hard you scrubbed. You tried to mask it with herbs, with mud, with whatever you could scavenge, but nature didn't care for your cleverness. It exposed you again and again. And snow? Snow was a death sentence. It made every step loud, crisp, impossible to muffle. It recorded your movements with brutal honesty. You could glide like a ghost through the woods, but the prints behind you told a story in perfect detail. Where you came from, how fast you moved, whether you limped, whether you stopped. You tried to backtrack, to disguise the trail, to sweep it away with branches. But every step left more evidence. And once the sun rose, the guards could follow your path like a child tracing lines in the dirt. In the city, snow made every roof slick. One misstep, one missed foothold, and you were a red smear in an alley before the job even started. You began to obsess over weather, cloud patterns, wind direction, soil texture. A sudden chill in the air was enough to make you call off a job entirely, because you knew what would happen if you ignored it. The wind would carry your cough into the next room. The rain would knock a loose tile and alert a sleeping guard. The snow would catch your boot print outside a stable door, and by morning you'd be dangling from the gallows, soaked to the bone and cursed by 100 tongues. There was no shelter from it. You couldn't bribe the wind. You couldn't silence the rain. You couldn't kill the cold. The weather didn't care about shadows and whispers. It tore the veil off your quiet craft and showed the world exactly where you were. You could plan for men. You could predict their habits, their greed, their fear. But nature played by no rules. And for an assassin who lived or died by silence, even the sky was out to get you. You didn't grow old, you just got slower, and then you died. There was no such thing as an aging assassin. Not really. You didn't live long enough to gray at the temples or limp with a cane while telling stories by the fire. Your joints stiffened, your reflexes dulled, and suddenly all those little margins that used to keep you alive, the half-second head start, the silent landing, the instinct to turn just before the blade struck, they vanished. And when they did, so did you. You didn't retire. You expired. No one wanted to hire an old killer. They wanted speed, silence, certainty. A man who could climb a roof in the rain and vanish through a keyhole. The moment someone saw your hands shake or heard your breath catch during a run, they started looking elsewhere. And in this trade, being passed over didn't just mean poverty. It meant someone newer, younger, faster, now had your name in their satchel. The shadows didn't make room for you. They closed around you like a trap. You told yourself you could adapt, rely on experience, use your mind where your body failed. But you were lying. You couldn't outthink a spear in your gut or a blade thrown by a man who'd been raised on stories of your prime. You'd spent your life making sure no one got the drop on you. Now your knees cracked when you crouched. Your fingers couldn't tie knots like they used to. You woke up with pain in your spine and blurred vision, not because you'd been injured, but because you were simply wearing out, like a rusted dagger too long in the rain. And worse, the fear you once commanded started to fade. People didn't look at you and see death anymore. They saw a broken man in a cloak too large for his frame. Your legend turned to myth and then to laughter. He used to be dangerous, they'd whisper. Used to be. Those words were knives of their own. Because once the world stopped fearing you, it started hunting you. And not always with weapons, sometimes with memory. People remembered your crimes. Even if they couldn't prove them, they could point, they could whisper, they could send guards to knock on your door long after your hands were too stiff to hold the knife that had made your name. You tried to hide, to disappear. But there's no peace for someone like you. You carried too many secrets, too many sins. The silence you once killed for became your cage. You couldn't sleep, couldn't trust anyone. And in the end, your death wasn't noble. It wasn't even noticed. Maybe it came with a knife in your back, or a fall no one witnessed. Maybe you just died alone in the woods, wrapped in your old cloak, clutching the blade that had served you until the end. You didn't grow old. You just kept going until the world outpaced you. And in a trade that demands perfection, even one step too slow is all it takes to vanish for good. Assassins weren't heroes in hoods. They were outcasts in mud-stained rags, hoping today wasn't their last. The legends got it wrong, all of them. The stories painted you as a mysterious figure, cloaked in silk, slipping through moonlight with a blade kissed by fate. They made it sound poetic, noble, almost romantic. But the truth was closer to rot than reverence. Your cloak was filthy, soaked in rain and sweat and God knows what else. Your boots leaked. Your knife was chipped. And you stank. Of fear, of blood, of the road. No one sang songs about the way your hands trembled after a job, or the nights you spent curled in a hayloft, too tired to sleep, but too scared to close your eyes. The minstrels never mentioned the part where you couldn't eat for 3 days after a kill, or how the coin you earned barely covered the cost of hiding. They left out the botched jobs, the silent breakdowns, the shaking knees when a child asked why your hands were red. You weren't some sacred avenger. You were a disposable solution to someone else's problem, and usually the problem wasn't solved until you were too. Every time someone told a tale of a hooded killer disappearing into the fog, they forgot the part where you stayed behind, soaked, exhausted, waiting to see if you'd been spotted, if the guard dog had caught your scent, if the client would actually pay, or poison your cup the moment you turned your back. The storytellers romanticized the silence, but silence was your prison. You couldn't speak your name, couldn't explain yourself, couldn't even scream when the nightmares came. The robes were fantasy. The mystique was a lie. You weren't part of a brotherhood. You didn't have a master with wise words and secret scrolls. You had frostbitten fingers, an infected wound that wouldn't close, and a list of people who wanted you dead. Your glory was imagined. Your reality was starvation, suspicion, and the smell of rotting hay in whatever abandoned barn you found that night. People feared you, sure, but they feared wolves and plagues too. Not because they admired you, but because they didn't want you near their children. You weren't a mystery. You were a curse, a shadow that brought death and left ruin. You didn't get respect. You got locked doors and prayers whispered behind your back. And if you died, And you would. The same people who once feared your name would spit on your corpse and tell their kids, that's what happens to monsters. So yes, the legends lied. They dressed your misery in silk and shadows. But the truth was dirt, cold, hunger, loneliness, and the constant, gnawing knowledge that no matter how many people you killed, the world would never see you as anything but a stain. It was trying to scrub clean. You weren't born a killer, but life twisted you, and eventually, you couldn't tell if you were still human. Once, a long time ago, you had a name that meant something. You had hands that didn't shake, a voice that didn't tremble, and a heart that didn't race at the sound of footsteps behind you. You had dreams, not of murder, but of peace, of being something more than a shadow. You didn't wake up wanting to put a blade in someone's ribs. That desire wasn't in you. Not at first. It was put there, little by little, by hunger, by betrayal, by a world that never had a place for people like you unless you took it by force. You tried to live straight. Maybe you begged. Maybe you stole. Maybe you joined a war, hoping discipline and loyalty would build you into something. But the world chews through good men fast. One moment of bad luck, one betrayal too many, and you stopped trying to be decent. The first time you killed, it wasn't for coin. It was because someone was going to kill you. The second time, it was because someone offered you bread. And after that, it became easier. Not easy, never easy, but easier. The blade stopped feeling strange in your hand. The silence after a kill stopped sounding so loud. But deep down, you still told yourself you weren't a monster. You had rules. You wouldn't kill women, or children, or priests. You only took contracts on those who deserved it. But the truth is, the line moved. It always did. Because eventually, every face blurred together. They all bled the same. They all screamed the same. And when your stomach was empty or a client dangled silver, your morals went quiet. They whispered excuses while your hands did the work. The worst part wasn't the killing. It was the moments between. When you looked at your reflection in a puddle and didn't know the man looking back. When a child flinched as you passed by, sensing something wrong, something cold, something off. Even if you hadn't drawn your blade. When you realized you hadn't felt joy or grief or anything real in years, you stopped being someone. You became a function, a tool, a walking silence wrapped in filthy cloth. And you didn't even notice when it happened. That was the cruelty. You didn't feel yourself break. You only noticed the absence after. One day you tried to remember who you were before the killing started, and nothing came. No memory, no face, no voice that felt like yours. Just echoes, just fragments. You told yourself you were still human, that if you survived long enough, you could walk away, start over, earn some kind of peace. But you knew better. Monsters aren't born. They're shaped by desperation, by violence, by 1,000 choices made in the dark. And when you looked back, there was no path to follow. Only blood, only shadow, only the fading memory of a man who once swore he'd never become this. You dreamed of vanishing, but no one really escaped. Not from the clients, not from the guilt. It was the lie you kept closest, that one day you'd slip away, that after one more job, maybe two, you'd disappear into the countryside, change your name, start over. Maybe as a farmer, a stonemason, something honest, something quiet. You'd find a village where no one asked questions. You'd tend a garden, sleep in a real bed, feel the sun on your face without flinching at every sound. But that was just a dream. A soft illusion to make the blood easier to wash off your hands. Because no one ever truly left this life. Not if you'd taken real contracts. Not if your blade had touched nobility, clergy, generals. Those people didn't forget. They didn't forgive. Even if you disappeared from sight, you lived in their minds, as a threat, as a liability, as something unfinished. The clients who paid you once would pay someone else to clean you up, because you knew too much. Names, faces, sins whispered in dark rooms. You were dangerous simply by surviving. You couldn't fade into obscurity because someone would always be looking, even if you didn't know it. And then there was the guilt. That didn't go away either. You could hide in the deepest woods, burn your old clothes, change your walk and your accent, but your memories followed. Every kill came with its own ghost, not just the ones who screamed, but the ones who didn't. The quiet ones. The ones whose eyes didn't understand what was happening until it was already over. They didn't yell in your dreams. They stared. You'd wake up in a sweat, gasping, hand already reaching for the knife under your blanket, the one you swore you'd stop carrying. You tried to forget. You buried your tools, tossed your coin into a river, recited prayers to gods you didn't believe in. But forgetting wasn't peace. It was rot. You still flinched when someone walked too close behind you. You still slept in corners, never with your back to a door. And when strangers asked where you came from, you'd lie too well, too easily. The assassin was gone in name, but he still lived in your bones. Even if no one ever came for you, even if you did find a place that welcomed you, a person who loved you, a life that seemed real, you still couldn't shake the sense that it was borrowed, that it would all be taken the moment someone said your name aloud in the wrong place. Because that's the final truth of the trade. You can change your face, your job, your fate, but you can't change what you've done. You don't get to escape. Not from the people you served, not from the people you killed, and not from the version of yourself who learned to live in silence and never really left. Thieves shared stories. Killers shared nothing. You were feared and completely alone. In the underworld of medieval cities, there was a kind of honor among criminals. Thieves swapped tales, drank together, traded tricks of the trade. They had fences to move stolen goods, taverns where they could blend in, networks built on grudging trust. But not you. You were the one they whispered about after the candles burned low. Not with admiration, with dread. Even the dirtiest cutpurse wanted nothing to do with a man who made people disappear without a sound. You didn't get invited to drink. You didn't get helped when you were cornered. If you walked into a thieves' den, the laughter stopped. People slipped out the back. Because where you went, trouble followed. You weren't seen as part of their world. You were something worse, something cursed. Thieves took things. You took lives. And that difference was everything. Killing wasn't just another crime. It changed how people looked at you, like they were afraid if they looked too long, they might end up on your list. Even when you tried to be civil, to make a deal, you could see it in their eyes. They didn't trust you. They didn't want to trust you. Because trust implied closeness, and closeness meant risk. What if you got caught? What if you talked? What if the guard offered a lighter sentence in exchange for names? And one of them was theirs. And deep down, they knew you wouldn't hesitate. You weren't bound by honor. You were bound by silence. Theirs or yours. And so you worked alone, always. No lookouts, no informants, no partners. You gathered your own intel, mapped your own routes, tied your own escape ropes. There was no one to watch your back. and no one you could call for help when things went wrong. And they did go wrong. A locked door that shouldn't have been, a guard who wasn't on patrol an hour ago, a floorboard that creaked louder than expected. Moments like that, a thief might have a crew to fall back on. You had only yourself, and the cold comfort that no one would mourn you if you didn't make it out. Eventually, the loneliness wasn't even surprising. It was expected. You forgot what it was like to talk without checking your tone, to laugh without glancing over your shoulder. You forgot how to sit in a room and feel welcome. You were always just passing through, always the outsider, always the threat that couldn't be reasoned with. And over time, you started to prefer it that way. Because fear was safer than trust, and silence, though heavy, was easier to carry than betrayal. So even in a world full of liars and criminals, you stood alone, not respected, not connected, just avoided. Because even the lowest thieves, the ones who slit purses and crawled through windows, knew better than to keep company with someone who killed for coin and never told stories afterward. Physically, morally, spiritually. The filth didn't wash off. Not even in a river. You could scrub your skin until it bled, dunk your head in icy streams, burn your clothes after a job, but it never left. The grime clung to you, inside and out. Mud from alleyways, blood from men who begged, soot from fires you didn't start, but always walked away from. You stank of sweat and rot and fear. And no matter how many times you tried to clean yourself, there was always something still under your nails, something caked in the creases of your palms, a residue of death that no water could lift. You started to forget what clean even felt like. You couldn't remember the last time your hands didn't carry a smell, the last time you bathed without watching your own reflection in the water, like it might reach out and strangle you. You'd wash in rivers before slipping into town, thinking it might help you blend in. But villagers still gave you wide eyes and quick steps, because the dirt on you wasn't just mud, it was something deeper, something people sensed before you even spoke. You weren't just unwashed, you were unclean, and you felt it. The longer you lived this life, the more it soaked into you. There wasn't a sin you hadn't touched. Murder, lies, betrayal, they followed you like shadows. Every man you killed stained something inside you. You stopped trying to tally them. Names faded, faces blurred, but their weight built up like rust. You wore it in your bones, in the slouch of your back, in the quiet way you moved when no one was watching. Your conscience wasn't gone. It was just buried under filth. Even the priests avoided you. You stepped into a church once, just once, and the silence was deafening. No one dared speak. No one met your eye. The priest mumbled a prayer and pretended not to recognize you, but he did. He could smell what you were. You didn't belong among holy things. You were the sort of soul the sermons warned about. Not to be saved, but to be feared. And somewhere along the way, you stopped believing in redemption. You weren't waiting for forgiveness. You didn't think there was any left to earn. You told yourself you didn't care, that this was just the price of survival. But some nights, when the wind died down and your blade was dry, you'd sit alone in the dark and wonder, if you vanished right then, would the earth even take you? Or would it spit you back out, filthy and damned? Because that was the truth. You weren't just dirty in the way of peasants and travelers. You were stained in ways that couldn't be seen, only felt. A kind of dirt that lived behind the eyes. A rot of the soul. And once it took hold, no river, no priest, no prayer could ever make you clean again. Eventually, someone spotted you, remembered a face, whispered a name, and the hunt began again. You could vanish for months, even years. change your clothes, your accent, the way you walked, burn every trail behind you. But it never lasted. Someone always remembered. Maybe it was a guard with a grudge and a good memory. Maybe a tavern girl who saw too much one night years ago. Maybe a drunk you bumped into who recognized your eyes from a wanted sketch half faded on a church door. It didn't take much. Just one glance held a beat too long. One whisper in the wrong alley. And suddenly, you were no longer invisible. The air shifted when it happened. You could feel it in your ribs. That slow, cold tightness wrapping around your chest. People stopped looking at you like a stranger and started glancing at you like a problem. Faces turned away too quickly. The barkeep got quiet. The usual streets felt tighter. That was how it started. Not with a blade, but with a silence that wasn't there before. A breathless sort of quiet that told you someone had put the pieces together. And when that happened, it was only a matter of time. Because in this world, names were dangerous. Yours had been spoken once too often. Maybe someone bragged about hiring you, thinking the legend would make them sound powerful. Maybe someone survived you, a botched job, a last-minute scream, and lived long enough to describe your eyes. Maybe your own arrogance let you linger too long in one place. Thought you'd earned a break. But assassins don't get breaks, they get chased. The hunt didn't come fast, it came steady. At first, a pair of boots behind you, then another. Faces you didn't recognize watching from shadows you did. A man at the market who didn't buy anything. A boy who kept running messages you couldn't trace. You knew what it meant. You were being mapped, surrounded. And once that net began to tighten, there was no sleeping, no eating, no rest, just running. Again. And if they didn't catch you today, they'd try tomorrow. Or next week. Or next year. Because names linger. Stories grow. And once the world knows you exist, it will never stop trying to erase you. You could cross rivers, mountains, oceans, but somewhere, someone would still be looking. Your face was out there now. A sketch nailed to a wall. A warning whispered to guards at every gate. A bounty passed from hand to hand, growing heavier with each telling. You told yourself you'd be ready, that you'd disappear again, fade back into the dark like you always did. But deep down, you knew the truth. The hunt didn't stop. It just paused. And every pause got shorter. One day, you wouldn't hear the whisper in time. One day, someone would spot you before you spotted them. And when that happened, all the names, all the masks, all the running, it wouldn't matter. Because the dark doesn't protect forever. Eventually, even the best shadows give you up. You killed kings, toppled regimes, but no one thanked you. You were just another weapon tossed aside. They called it service sometimes. Said your work kept the realm safe. Said your blade removed the rot at the top. They whispered that your kills reshaped history, that a war was avoided, a rebellion silenced, a tyrant stopped before his cruelty could fester any further. But when it was over, when the body cooled and the blood dried, the only reward you got was silence. No honor, no coin, if they could help it. And certainly no gratitude. Because no one wants to admit that the world turns on murder. That power is often passed not through treaties or scrolls, but through a quiet death in the dark. They needed you, yes, but they didn't want to see you. You were useful in theory, terrifying in practice. A reminder that even the highest walls, the deepest vaults, and the thickest armies couldn't stop a man with nothing to lose and a sharp piece of iron. So they paid you, if you were lucky, and then they erased you. Not to protect you, to protect themselves. You thought the kills meant something, especially early on. that you were removing tyrants, balancing kingdoms, serving some greater order. But that was just another lie they fed you. The reality? You weren't killing monsters. You were killing obstacles. Inheritance disputes, land negotiations, clergy power struggles. You weren't reshaping the world. You were cleaning up after the powerful, and doing it in a way that couldn't be traced. You made the blood disappear, and in return, they made you disappear. And if you survived long enough to see the aftermath, you realized the next man they crowned was often worse. The chaos didn't stop. The corruption didn't end. The people didn't cheer. Nothing changed except the name on the throne and the weight in your chest. But even then, part of you hoped someone would say the words, just once, "Thank you for the risk, for the silence, for the wounds you stitched alone in freezing barns, or the ghosts you carried with you into each new town." But they never did, because they didn't want to thank a killer. They wanted to forget one existed. You weren't a hero. You weren't even real. You were the shadow that fixed a problem and then faded. No medal, no monument, just a name on someone's lips. A name quickly swallowed the moment the job was done. And when they told the story later, around a fire or in a royal court, they'd skip your part. The tyrant died mysteriously, they'd say, or fate intervened. But not you. Never you. That was the deal. Do the dirty work. Die quietly. And if by some miracle you lived, live knowing that the world you helped shape had no place for you in it. You were a weapon. And weapons don't get thanks. They get used, then discarded. You killed one man. 10 more came looking for you. The job never ended. It just multiplied. Each successful hit felt like a conclusion, a clean end, a closed contract. But it was never just one body. One death opened 10 new doors, each leading to more chaos, more vengeance, more people with reasons to see you buried. You didn't kill a man. You disrupted a power structure. You cracked open a family's pride. You turned political gears that screamed for retaliation. And they came for you. Sons, cousins, loyal guards, hired blades with their own debts to pay. They didn't care why you did it. They only cared that you did. And it wasn't just family. You upset clients too. Some wanted discretion and got blood in the street. Some expected a clean job and found themselves tangled in scandal. Others never planned for you to come back at all. A dead assassin is easier to explain than a living one with questions. So even when you did everything right, the target wasn't the end. He was just the beginning of whispers, of wanted posters, of long roads where every stranger looked a little too long and every silence felt like a trap being sprung. Enemies didn't need reasons. They needed opportunities. You built a life that attracted enemies by design, just for existing, just for succeeding, just for walking away from a kill that mattered to someone. You couldn't count how many times you'd seen that look, the slow, venomous stare from across a tavern, or the guard who lingered too long at your table. You couldn't always place them, but they recognized you. And when you left, someone followed. You kept moving, always. You changed towns, clothes, names. But names have ways of leaking. Someone recognized your walk, your habits, your scars. And when they didn't, they recognized your work. They'd look at a corpse and say, "It was him. I know it." Whether they were right or not didn't matter. Once your legend started, it ran ahead of you like wildfire. And legends breed enemies faster than facts. Eventually, you stopped hoping the cycle would break. It wouldn't. The job was endless, like trying to mop up a flood with a bloodied rag. You'd end one man, and three more would show up, each one with a dagger and a reason. Some were better than you. Most weren't. But they only had to get lucky once. You, on the other hand, had to stay sharp forever. One mistake, 1 second of hesitation, and you'd be the body on the floor. Another quiet footnote in a string of silent vendettas. You realized, too late, that your enemies didn't die. Not really. You killed the body, but not the ripple. The revenge, the suspicion, the endless churn of blood for blood, that lived on. And in that churn, you became part of it. A ghost always on the run, always waiting for the next name, the next face, the next knife behind a smile. You weren't erasing problems. You were writing new ones with every kill. Your name didn't end up in books. Your deeds were erased. And no one told your story. The work you did, the lives you ended, the kings you helped rise or fall. They all vanished into history, like smoke into the wind. There were no chroniclers waiting outside the gates to write your name in golden ink. No monks hunched over scrolls, detailing the blade's quiet path through flesh. You weren't even a footnote. You were a ghost, and ghosts don't get legacies. And maybe that was the point. You were never meant to be remembered. The people who hired you made sure of that. They spoke your name in whispers, if at all, and then pretended you never existed. A noble dies in his sleep. A priest falls from his balcony. A general is found with no wound, but a blue tint to his lips. There's no mention of the man in the shadows, the one who waited in the cold for hours, the one who risked everything. Just mystery, rumor, and then nothing. Even those who knew you, the fence who passed your messages, the girl who sewed your wounds, the one friend who stuck around longer than they should have, they never carved your name anywhere. Not from fear, but because they knew you wouldn't want them to. That's what the life demanded. Silence, then disappearance. And eventually, even the people who whispered your story around tavern fires forgot the details. You faded into myth, then into rumor, then not at all. You thought once that maybe you could keep something behind, a journal, a mark on a wall, a name scratched into the bottom of a pew in some far-off village chapel, but even that felt dangerous. A single word left behind in the wrong place could draw fire on you or someone you cared about. So you didn't write. You didn't speak. You lived like a shadow and died like one, unmarked, unnamed. And so the world moved on. The kings you killed were replaced by new ones, just as cruel. The wars you stopped broke out again under different flags. The secrets you silenced were spoken again in other tongues. It was as if you had never existed at all. And in a way, you hadn't. You were never a person to them, just a tool, a whisper with a knife. And once the job was done, you were wiped clean like chalk from a slate. No one mourned you. No one raised a toast in your name. No one passed down your story. And if someone, centuries later, stumbles across the result of something you did, a curious death, an abrupt shift in power, they'll never know it was you. Your hand, your silence, your sacrifice. Because the final truth is this: assassins don't leave legacies. They leave nothing. And nothing is easy to forget. Eventually, you stopped speaking, stopped hoping. You became what everyone feared, a silent shadow with no soul. It didn't happen all at once. At first, silence was part of the job, a necessary precaution. No names, no questions, no witnesses. You whispered only when needed, kept your voice low, your answers vague. But over time, silence stopped being a tactic and started becoming a truth. Words felt heavier, meaningless. Why explain yourself to people who would never understand, or worse, report you? Why share a joke when you'd be gone by morning or dead by nightfall? So you said less, then nothing. You learned to move through towns like a ghost, nod once, pay in coin, avoid eye contact. Your voice, once something you trusted, became a liability. It gave you away. It made you visible. And eventually, it felt foreign. When you did try to speak, the words felt dry in your mouth, like they belonged to someone else. So you stopped trying. Not out of discipline, out of detachment. Hope vanished the same way. Slowly, then all at once. You stopped thinking about escape, about change, about anything resembling a future. You no longer pictured yourself retiring, or falling in love, or even living long enough to watch the seasons turn. Those thoughts were dangerous, not just because they were unlikely, but because they made you vulnerable. And vulnerability got you killed. So you let go of names, of plans, of everything that used to matter. You lived moment to moment, job to job, breath to breath, and the world saw it. They didn't see a man anymore. They saw a warning, a figure who moved like smoke, who never spoke, whose eyes didn't blink in firelight. You became the thing people feared in stories. A killer without remorse, without humanity, without a name. A walking silence. They weren't wrong either, because something inside you had gone quiet too. Something warm, something essential. It didn't scream when it left. It just faded, like everything else. You didn't even mind after a while. Silence was simpler. It didn't betray you. It didn't argue. It didn't ask why you did the things you did. It just followed you, wrapped around you, seeped into your skin like smoke into stone. It was your cloak, your companion, your curse. And in that stillness, you stopped being afraid. Not because you were brave, because you had nothing left to lose. You didn't become a legend. You didn't become free. You became exactly what the world feared you would, a shadow with no voice and no soul, slipping between rooftops with empty eyes and a blade that remembered what you no longer could. The silence won. And in that silence, whatever you once were, man, son, friend, was gone. All that remained was what the world made you, a ghost in a world that never wanted you to be anything else. In the end, you didn't retire. You vanished, not in a blaze of glory or with some final heroic breath. You just stopped. You slipped into a nameless village with cracked stone walls and dirt roads nobody wrote maps for. You picked a name from the air, something forgettable, something that didn't echo. You told the baker you were a former soldier. Told the stable boy you had a limp from a fall, not from a poisoned dagger that missed its mark by inches. You nodded, smiled when required, kept to yourself, and hoped no one asked the wrong questions. You worked odd jobs, moved rocks, split wood, fixed roofs. You spoke little, laughed even less. You slept in a small room behind a tavern, with a door that didn't lock and a window you could climb through if things ever went bad. They didn't, but you always had a bag packed anyway. You stayed ready. You always stayed ready, even when there was nothing left to run from except memory. The villagers barely noticed you, and that was the point. You had no visitors, no letters, no family. When they spoke of you at all, it was in the vague tones they used for things they didn't quite trust. Quiet man, keeps to himself. Bit strange, but never causes trouble. You weren't part of the village. You were something adjacent, a shape in the background that made sense only because it never did anything unexpected. You thought maybe at first you'd find some peace, that living slow and low would scrape the blood off your soul, but nothing washed off. The silence followed you. The old instincts never dulled. Every creak in the night still made your hand reach for a blade. Every friendly face still held the potential for betrayal. You hadn't escaped your past. You just buried it beneath a different kind of quiet. And then one day you didn't wake up. Maybe it was in your sleep, finally unguarded. Maybe it was alone in the woods, clutching your chest as your heart gave out in a place no one would find you. However it happened, there was no one to mark the moment, no one to light a candle, no one to say your name, real or false. The tavern owner found your things, asked around, and after a few days, gave your room to someone else. They buried your body behind the chapel, or maybe they burned it, or maybe the crows handled it. It didn't matter. You didn't get a grave with your name. You didn't get remembered. Because that's the only way out of a life like this, to vanish so completely that even death forgets you. Not celebrated, not cursed, just gone. The only escape was obscurity. And in the end, you achieved it. Not by running, not by fighting, but by simply disappearing. Quietly, finally, completely.